Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. And Russian nuclear submarines and warships are now in the Venezuelan coastline. Trump, you made a terrible mistake. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution? Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, I've been warning y'all about this, and y'all been paying attention. Very dangerous times we living in, and Putin and Xi Jinping will never let Trump do whatever he wants to do with Venezuela. Let's get into the content. Salute.
Our country's at a tipping point.
Trump must humble himself.
We could go bad. We're at a tipping point.
A tipping point, folks, that might be the understatement of the year, because while the media is obsessing over clickbait, manufactured outrage, NATO's worst nightmare is quietly becoming reality. Technocratic control of the United States under Palantir and Peter Thiel and all of those guys is happening in real time. And yes, everything is changing right before our eyes. I'm going to show you exactly how this is unfolding. So over the past 48 hours, I received exclusive information from sources, information that has not been reported anywhere else. And here it is, that 2 Russian nuclear submarines have arrived off the coast of Venezuela, and more are on their way. This is in addition to the Russian battleships and cruisers, which have already headed to the region, and that has been reported. Let that sink in. These are not patrol ships. These are not advisors. These are nuclear submarines. And if you understand Russia's nuclear submarine fleet right now, this should set off alarms, because Russia's undersea nuclear capability is not just competitive with the United States, it's blowing us away. It surpasses us in several key areas: in size, in stealth, innovation. Their 2 new style submarines are the apex predators of the ocean right now, and we can't compete. And they are parked right now in our hemisphere. Why? Because something much bigger is happening behind the scenes, something Washington and Brussels don't want to talk about. They keep talking around it, but we're going to talk straight at it today. And here it is. Last week, President Trump quietly unveiled what insiders are now calling the Trump Doctrine. You could call it the Trump Corollary.
Y'all won't be blind.
It's a seismic rewriting of the U.S. grand strategy that effectively ends the unipolar order that America has dominated since 1945. The U.S. as the reserve currency, as the superpower, gone. Trump just declared it. Dare I say that this is a game changer? You probably didn't hear about it because the media totally ignored it completely, actually.
U.S. trip.
But Europe heard it. China heard it. Russia definitely heard it, hence the submarines. And Trump told the truth that NATO never once spoken out loud. There are now 3 great powers in the world: the United States, China, and Russia. That's it. Europe, according to Trump's own national security team, Europe will cease to be relevant within 20 years. Their entire civilization changed forever. This isn't me saying this. This is the Trump administration's official view, written down in a new doctrine.
Yeah, that's true.
Trump's new strategy doctrine.
But so will the U.S. if they continue on the path that they're on right now. There probably won't be no U.S. That's what China and Russia and North Korea is telling the U.S. See, this is a trap. Trump want to destroy Venezuela, subjugate the Middle East, subjugate Latin America, and he was trying to offer Ukraine to Putin. Putin don't want his dirty offer. He want bricks and want to help the world. You see, Trump is getting nervous. He put that on paper that Europe is finished. He probably gonna be pulling out of NATO. But this is all a trick, and Putin knows this. That's why the nuclear warships popped up. So they just letting Trump know, just stop playing games, and we can get right to it if you want to.
Document essentially stunned the mainstream by bluntly stating that Europe faces a civilizational collapse, and it will be finished in 20 years.
Look,
and of course, that means the death of NATO.
When they talk about Europe, never forget, where the hell you think the Americans are, Europeans? They could be finished too if it wasn't for us. That's a fact. The U.S. will be done. We're the lifeline, keeping them. They would have the same fate as the Europeans. They've been following them around all these centuries. Now Europe is over, but the U.S. not. The U.S. is finished by the way they've been going along as imperialist invaders, stealing everything. That's over with. That's officially over with. And I've been told you that. There's nowhere on this planet they can get away with doing that. Iran just showed them you can't do it over there no more. Russia put an end to it in Ukraine. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, they're trying to stand up and help to do it in Africa. And what's happening in Venezuela, it's the last straw. You can't even do it in Latin America no more.
A fossil that no longer is relevant. Colonel Douglas reacted on our show earlier this week by saying bluntly that NATO is dead. Watch.
NATO is disintegrating. We're trying to maintain this facade that such an alliance actually existed as meaningful. But if you look at Berlin right now and Germany is like a volcano that is beginning to erupt.
This is the real world now. And Trump, unlike the neocons, is acknowledging it. So let's talk about Venezuela, because what you're being told is the sanitized version of what's happening there. You're told it's about narco-terrorism. That's a lie, of course, as we've debunked. So if you go one layer deeper, you probably think, oh, then it's about oil. But it's not even about that. You're told, oh, it's about Maduro. It's not about that either. Oh, it's about restoring democracy. Nope, it's not that. The real story that no insiders want to talk about is this. China is deeply entwined in Venezuela. China built the refineries. China built the infrastructure. They're building ports all through Latin America. China refines 30% of Venezuela's oil just off the coast in the Orinoco Belt. So yes, it's about oil, but it's about China's influence in our hemisphere, full stop. And Trump's new doctrine is a blunt reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine. The Western Hemisphere belongs to us, not Beijing. And the moment Trump publicly rolled out this new strategy, guess who showed up? Russia sent nuclear submarines to Venezuela to say, hey, we're here too.
Come on.
And you don't get to box us out. Are we playing this game?
Telling them that's over with. You don't offer Trump, offer them Ukraine. Putin sent nuclear submarines. You don't make those. You don't offer him things, brother. He offered you peace. You don't tell him we'll give Ukraine, but we're going to wipe out Cuba and Venezuela, and we're going to wipe out Iran. Putin is showing the world he don't do that. He was not going to backstab his allies so they can come get him in the end. But Trump and them is playing with our lives now. You know, as revolutionaries, we're like, oh, shit, Russia done pulled up. Wait a minute. Russia has pulled up. Whoa. Wait a minute. This is not good. The end of the empire is great. But like I've been telling y'all for a long time, I've been saying that we just got to survive. We just got to survive what's going to happen to the United States. And it don't matter Trump offer Putin Europe. And that's what he did on paper. The Europeans are very pissed. It don't matter because the U.S. don't get to make dirty offers like that no more to the world.
No more. And what sources are telling me right now is that these three superpowers are shifting everything. Trump's own documents now say China is not an enemy; they're an economic competitor. The new Trump doctrine says we're done being the cops of the world. Essentially,
China is not an enemy. What after they just humiliated Trump before the world? He tried everything he could. He couldn't break China. China forced the U.S. hand, forced the capitulation of Trump, humiliated Trump. Xi Jinping humiliated him. Trump was begging that man for months, please just speak to me. Now Trump put it on paper, China is no longer an enemy, bro. The whole world knows what's going on. The whole world knows what's going on. It's the end of the empire. Trump is trying to save the little vassal places that he can. Just let us have Venezuela. And they saying, hell no. You get nothing. You don't get to control sovereign lands anymore. And that's all the world need, a fair chance for the U.S. not to invade them if they don't have what they call a democracy. What a joke.
It says Taiwan, yeah, it's important, but it's not important if other countries aren't going to pay their fair share to actually assist in the defense of Taiwan, like Europe. In other words, Trump is saying, we're going to start keeping our eyes on our own paper. Absolutely. And you'd better start doing the same because we're not going to pay for it anymore. Now, the Trump doctrine isn't just anti-China. It also sidelines Moscow in a big way. It says America is no longer trying to run the entire planet, only its own hemisphere. Fortress America, essentially, where the concerns about a technocratic rise in America come into play, right? It's for our security that we need to.
You get to run America, that's none of our business. You don't run the hemisphere. You do not run Venezuela. You don't get to tell Venezuela what to do. All that talking shit, see, this is the problem. They don't tell y'all enough of what's going on in the news. All that talking tough, we send out our destroyers, our warships. Guess what? Venezuelans don't give a shit. Neither do China, Russia, Iran. None of those people care about none of that stuff. Those are nice, shiny toys, which they rip off our money and tell you they spend trillions on that crap, but they lose every war with that nonsense. Russia just pulled up in the Venezuelan water with nuclear submarines. I ain't heard a peep from the news because they want to scare y'all to death because they've been bluffing. Ain't nobody bluffing. Nobody playing with the U.S. no more. That's over with. Especially when they seen your last work in Afghanistan. Ain't nobody scared of you. That's just the truth, bro.
They have all this biometric scanning and surveillance.
Boy, I can't
under
wait to fight.
Palantir. So we're going to see how that part unfolds. But if Trump can pull this off, it's going to piss off a lot of war hawks at NATO who want us to go to war with Russia, who want us to invade Venezuela, who want us to keep bombing Somalia and the Houthis in Yemen. This is a massive shift, the biggest since 1945. From a global policeman to a continental superstate. Can we pull it off? That means enormous opportunities here at home if this happens. You can already see it in construction and manufacturing. The demand for electrical engineers in this country is off the charts. Forget those like little bloggers that sit on a beach and write like travel blogs. No. What America needs now are real people that know how to do real jobs. Trump has essentially admitted something the political class never wanted to say out loud, that tariffs alone have not stopped China. The supply chain still sits in Asia, and our entire manufacturing base is hollowed out and gone. So now he's doing something much more radical. He's cutting off the hemisphere, a sealed economic and military wall, a fortified hemisphere, a return to pre-World War II strategic thinking, which we had in the United States, but on steroids. And this is why mass manufacturing is now being forced back into the United States. Rare earth mining is being nationalized, essentially. I mean, the U.S. is literally investing in precious metals, silver, copper, nickel. It's a vital national security interest, as Trump has declared it. Tariffs are being weaponized, of course, and Chinese influence is being ripped out of Latin America by force if necessary. Will they go quietly? Let's see how this plays out. Will Xi Jinping blink? Will Putin blink? This is not a policy tweak. This is a civilizational pivot right now. And the rest of the world is reacting. Europe is melting down. As Moon of Alabama put it bluntly, the new U.S. strategy strangles Europe, competes with China, and forgets the rest. And Europe knows it. They're done. Because if America withdraws its global NATO umbrella and China and Russia rise, which they are, then Europe essentially becomes irrelevant. And they know what's coming. Demographic collapse, energy shortages you're seeing all over Germany, industrial decline, a dependent military, a migrant crisis that cannot be reversed. Europe is staring at extinction as a geopolitical actor, and Trump just said it out loud and put it in a policy paper. This is why we're seeing panic behind the scenes. And speaking of panic, here's something else that sources have told me. There are 11,000 Chinese engineers currently in the United States. What are they doing here? Engineers? Not students, not tourists. Engineers. And U.S. officials admit they have no idea where many of them are or what exactly they're even doing. So let me repeat that. Thousands of Chinese engineers inside the United States as Trump rolls out a doctrine designed explicitly to keep Eastern influence out of our hemisphere. Over the past 4 years under Biden, 200,000 Chinese came into the United States, 200,000. And of course, Trump wants to open the doors for 500,000 students to come in, which is all very weird, right? So do you see like a weird collision course happening here? 2026 is going to be an absolute mess. The economic front is collapsing. At the same time, the geopolitical world is shifting. Right now, the United States businesses are going bankrupt at a blistering pace. New report out this week that we are entering a year where the economy breaks apart. NATO fractures and breaks apart. China tightens its grip. Russia plants nuclear submarines in our backyard. And America declares a new hemispheric empire. This is why Trump said we are at a tipping point. This is why you feel the tension right now. You feel why neocons are melting down. And according to journalist Lara Logan, who I spoke to this week, she says there are people inside Trump's own circle actively trying to sabotage this doctrine, this plan, before it even starts. Listen to what she told me this week.
There are questions, valid questions about a lot of people, a number of people, I wouldn't say a lot, but a number of people in this administration that have yet to be answered that are cause for some concern because of the lack of action that has followed.
So guys, this is the opening move of a new global order. One hemisphere under America, one hemisphere under China, one Eurasian superbloc that's under Russia and China combined. 3 poles, 3 empires, no Europe, no NATO, no unipolar world, with us playing the cops. So I think this is the most important geopolitical shift of our lifetime, and nobody in the mainstream press is covering it, of course. So we'll see how this all unfolds. So that's the news up.
Yeah, they playing with fire, about to get burned.
Imagine waking up to the sudden news that the world's most powerful aircraft carrier has just sailed into one of the most politically volatile seas on the planet. On paper, the mission sounds simple: counter drug trafficking. But anyone following the region knows this is only the surface. Venezuela's government is furious, accusing Washington of preparing the battlefield for something much bigger. And behind Venezuela stands an ally that never sits quietly: Russia. As U.S. warships close in and Russian support deepens, the Caribbean begins to look less like a tranquil blue playground and more like the next arena for great power confrontation. Let's break down how we got here. The first domino fell when President Trump approved the deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group into Caribbean waters. According to U.S. officials, the mission is meant to intensify counter-narcotics operations and cut off drug routes that allegedly involve Venezuela's security apparatus. But the choice of asset immediately raised red flags. The Ford isn't a patrol boat, it's a nuclear-powered fortress designed for global power projection. And that message was heard loud and clear in Caracas. President Nicolas Maduro accused Washington of engineering a pretext for military aggression. His government condemned the move as a direct threat to national sovereignty, warning that the United States was trying to intimidate Venezuela at a time of deep political and economic crisis. Latin American governments reacted with unease too, but the loudest voice came from across the Atlantic. Moscow criticized the deployment as an excessive and destabilizing act, promising that Russia would not abandon Venezuela in its moment of crisis. With just one order from Washington, the U.S. had unintentionally dragged an old Cold War rivalry back into a region that both sides still see as strategically priceless. To understand why this deployment matters, we need to understand what exactly the U.S. just parked off Venezuela's coast. The USS Gerald R. Ford isn't just a carrier. It's the most technologically advanced warship ever built. This massive nuclear-powered giant can launch more sorties per day than any other carrier in history. It carries stealth fighters, airborne early warning aircraft, electronic warfare platforms, and drones. Its escort group includes destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and missile defense ships, together forming a strike package capable of overwhelming any military in the region within minutes. This is the ship Washington used to intimidate adversaries in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Now it's parked in America's own backyard, facing a government that the U.S. accuses of enabling drug cartels, partnering with Iran, and deepening military ties with Russia. The arrival of the Ford isn't just military posturing, it reshapes the balance of power in the Caribbean. For the U.S., it means rapid strike capability. For Venezuela, it means living under the shadow of a massive floating airbase. And for Russia, it means answering the question, do they stand by Venezuela publicly or militarily? The moment the Ford entered the Caribbean, Moscow made its intentions clear. Venezuela is not standing alone. Russia publicly condemned the U.S. move and reaffirmed its support for Venezuela's sovereignty, calling Washington's deployment aggressive and destabilizing. But Moscow didn't stop at statements. It pointed out that Russian-Venezuelan cooperation is ongoing and already involves military assistance. Now let's address the scenario everyone's been waiting for. Not just Russian air defense units, not just advisors, but Russia's sea monsters entering the Caribbean. Because if Moscow decides to challenge the US Navy head-on, it won't send patrol boats. It will send warships designed to hunt carriers. This is where the tension becomes real. Imagine the USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's largest aircraft carrier, suddenly detecting long-range radar signatures creeping in from across the Atlantic. Not civilian vessels, not commercial tankers, but Russian heavy hitters. The Admiral Gorshkov-class frigate, armed with Zircon hypersonic missiles capable of flying at Mach 9 and striking ships over 1,000 kilometers away, and the nuclear-powered Yasin M submarine, nicknamed Russia's Silent Killer, loaded with Kaliber and Onyx missiles that specialize in carrier-killing missions. Or worse, the Kirov-class battlecruiser, a floating fortress the size of a small town, often referred to as Russia's sea monster because of its massive P-700 Granite anti-ship missiles designed during the Cold War to sink U.S. carriers. If even one of these vessels arrives in Venezuelan waters, the Caribbean transforms from a U.S. comfort zone into one of the world's most dangerous naval theaters. Suddenly, the Ford's air wing wouldn't just be conducting patrols, it would be actively tracking hypersonic missile threats, submerged hunters, and long-range Russian recon aircraft circling overhead. The entire strike group, destroyers, cruisers, and subs would shift into high alert mode. Now picture this escalation. A US F-35 launches from the Ford for a reconnaissance mission near Venezuela. On the horizon, a Russian Gorshkov frigate locks its radar, quietly broadcasting that it has the range, the sensors, and the hypersonic firepower to engage the carrier itself. Meanwhile, deep underwater, a Yasin M submarine shadows the strike group, listening, calculating, and waiting.
Okay. Told you that was a bad mistake.
The U.S. Navy hasn't faced this kind of high-end competitor in the Caribbean for decades, and this is exactly the point Russia wants to make. By sending its naval heavyweights, Moscow signals that Venezuela is not isolated, not vulnerable, and not facing the U.S. alone. Even if Russia doesn't fire a single shot, the presence of these sea monsters changes everything, forcing Washington to reconsider every move, every strike, every political decision. Because once hypersonic missiles and nuclear-powered submarines enter the equation, miscalculation becomes a nightmare. So how close are we to a showdown? The truth is, neither side wants an open war. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.
It's not the first time this happened. In the 70s, the U.S. and Britain was talking about attacking India, an ally of the Soviet Union. And just read history. What happened? Russians sent their nuclear submarine up the, I think it was the Bengal. One of those Indian rivers, the oceans, they sent their into the Indian Ocean. Yeah. They sent their submarines into the Indian Ocean, right? You can look that up. And then the U.S. and France and Britain, they got the message to back off. They wasn't just sending their nuclear submarines for a field trip. This is not the first time, bro, Russia's done this. Now they sent their submarines and they got warships and they just tell it. See, what they're telling Trump behind closed doors is not games. They tell him exactly what's going to happen to him if he commit an act of aggression against a sovereign nation. A nation who has every right to do whatever it wants to defend itself. You're going to be legally liable for whatever how you telling Trump, and we're not going to let you get away with it. That's what they're telling Trump.
With you, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Danny. It's always a pleasure.
Oh, pleasure to be with you always.
I told y'all, China's sitting back waiting. See, I've been told to people, China is the bank, Russia's the military. China has the money, Russia has the military supremacy. Perfect duo. Once U.S. commit an act of aggression, China gonna sanction the U.S. like the U.S. did to Russia for the Ukraine war. China have every right to. They just showed the U.S. what they'll do to them in a tariff war. That's why Trump begging for China to be nice. Hell no. If you attack Venezuela, you're going to have a military defeat and you're going to have an economic defeat. Watch.
Everyone hit the like button as you come on. That helps boost the stream and YouTube's algorithm. Also, give a little audio check for us if you can, because there's some concern about it. But if there's no issues, then we're all good to go. Ben, let's get started right away with this U.S. war on Venezuela that is ever so close, yet hasn't launched into the full-scale war that Trump has been threatening yet. Now, many observers in the hawkish Western mainstream media are now sounding the alarm that this war may have already failed. And I want to show you just a few examples of this. Here's in the Financial Times. Trump needs an off-ramp in Venezuela. This is from Francisco Rodriguez, who's actually someone who supports the opposition. He says, for years, U.S. foreign policy hawks have argued putting more pressure on Caracas through sanctions and the threat of force would lead to the military support for the regime to collapse. That strategy has failed once again, leading proponents calling for further escalation. And here it is here, calling for further escalation. This risks embroiling the U.S. in a protracted military conflict with potentially huge human costs. And now with the new national security strategy that has just come out, Ben, I want to show you what NATO actually is saying, the Atlantic Council. Here is someone from the Atlantic Council writing in The Hill. He says here, why U.S. actions in Venezuela could backfire across the globe. And I'm just going to go down to his points. He first makes the point that China will be emboldened, of course, in the South China Sea and Taiwan, then goes on to talk about how Venezuela military action against it would be utilized by Putin as a symmetrical justification for his unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. It's a staple of Russian propaganda, and that it's a narrative that could gain traction in countries of the global South, which Russia has been assiduously courting. Now, Ben, the national security strategy says it's going to be directed more at countries like Venezuela in the Western Hemisphere. How about you give your take on what is going on, the role also of Russia and China in this war that's being provoked right now by the United States, because it seems like the Western mainstream media and the Atlantic Council in particular is paying attention to this.
Well, one of the biggest takeaways from the national security strategy that was released by the Trump White House is that its top priority is imposing U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere and the Monroe Doctrine. This is an over 200-year-old colonial doctrine that says essentially that the U.S. empire treats all of the Western Hemisphere, especially Latin America, as part of its imperial sphere of influence, violating the sovereignty of countries in the region. So this is a big reason why we see these attacks on Venezuela. Now, I know we'll talk about this later, Danny, but if you listen to the Western media, the main takeaway that they got from this national security strategy report is essentially that Trump is moving or trying to move out of Europe, that he wants a strategic reset with Russia in order to focus on China. That's, of course, a key part of it. But I would say that there are two main kind of goals. What we're seeing here is, one, preparing for potential conflict in what the U.S. calls the Indo-Pacific region, and in particular, trying to decouple from China as part of the new Cold War with China. And then the other takeaway is what I said, trying to impose U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere and revive the colonial Monroe Doctrine. And Venezuela has always been one of the biggest thorns in the side of the U.S. empire, because Venezuela has an independent government. And in particular, Venezuela is a close partner of China, Russia, and Iran, who are the big U.S. boogeymen. So the U.S., especially Marco Rubio, of course, Trump started a coup attempt in Venezuela during his first term as U.S. president. Marco Rubio was not in his administration then. He was just a senator. But now, of course, Marco Rubio is the second most powerful person in the U.S. government after Trump himself. Rubio is serving as both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. And Rubio has dedicated his life to overthrowing the left-wing governments in Cuba, first of all. His parents are right-wing oligarchs who fled Cuba to the U.S. before the revolution, by the way, before the 1959 revolution. And Marco Rubio has lied about that a lot. But he wants to overthrow the Cuban government, the Nicaraguan Sandinista government, and of course the Venezuelan government. And we now see that what we're saying, all these factors come together, right? The new Cold War in China, check. The Monroe Doctrine, the revival of this colonial doctrine, check. And Marco Rubio's lifelong commitment to overthrowing these governments, check. And also, Trump is using this absurd narrative of fighting drug trafficking, which is one of the most cynical and hypocritical things ever. Because meanwhile, Trump is literally freeing from prison the worst drug traffickers on earth, like the former dictator of Honduras, the US-backed dictator Juan Hernandez. And Hernandez was working with Mexico's cartel leader, the infamous El Chapo Guzman. He was given millions of dollars by El Chapo in order to steal the elections in Honduras. He was convicted of trafficking more than 400 tons of cocaine and machine guns. Trump just released him from prison, and he pardoned him while Trump and the U.S. government are meddling in Honduras's election amid blatant accusations of fraud, some of the most blatant fraud I've seen in my life. To put in power this narco regime in Honduras, the U.S. is also backing a right-wing narco regime in Ecuador. So the U.S. is allied with all of these drug dealers in the region. Meanwhile, they claim that they have to go against Venezuela because of drug trafficking, even though all international experts in the drug trade know that Venezuela basically plays no significant role in the international drug trade. There's almost no drug production in Venezuela, and there's a small amount of drug trafficking through Venezuela, but not that much. Meanwhile, next door, Colombia is the epicenter of global cocaine production. So, I mean, it's just the most hypocritical thing you can imagine, but it's all part of the strategy, which is essentially, again, the recognition that in the short term, the U.S. cannot wage a war against China. It would be too destructive, and they're too economically integrated together. So in the short term, the U.S. is trying to decouple economically from China, diversify its supply chain, reduce its dependencies on China. And while it's preparing for future conflict with China, what it's now doing is trying to impose U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere and overthrow all of the independent governments in Latin America. And Venezuela is kind of the most symbolic country in the region in terms of standing up to the U.S. empire. And the U.S. strategy is they think it's like this domino strategy. If they can overthrow Venezuela, then they can overthrow Nicaragua's Sandinista government, then they can overthrow Cuba's revolutionary government. And then, of course, the big prize would be Brazil, which would be more difficult. Brazil is the largest country, but they already tried doing that with, the imprisonment of Lula da Silva on fake charges in 2018. The U.S. Justice Department was behind that. So we see that, the U.S. strategy is to destabilize any independent governments in Latin America, reshore production in the region, take, factories and supply chains out of China and move them into the Americas. And of course, these would be U.S. corporations that would be running these factories in Latin America, exploiting cheap labor in Latin America. And then when they have, decoupled economically, as they put it, from China, then prepare for more conflict with China.
Yeah, and let's look at inside the national security strategy now that you've brought all this up, Ben, because I want to go to page 9, which I find hilariously ironic. Well, actually, this is not but the real page 9 here is actually page 13. Predisposition to non-interventionism. At the end, it says, after talking about the founding fathers, how they're separate but equal systems and countries respecting one another in the world, for a country whose interests are numerous and diverse as ours, rigid adherence to non-interventionism is not possible. Yet this predisposition should set a high bar for what constitutes justified intervention. And then I want to go now to the Trump Colliery. You mentioned the Monroe Doctrine. This Trump Colliery to the Monroe Doctrine is a common sense and potent restoration of American power and priorities consistent with American security interests. After years of neglect, the U.S. will assert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine to restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. And Ben, you know, despite all of the threats, especially toward Venezuela as a big jump off point for this, there's some really interesting responses from Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. I'll just play one of them here. Sorry about that. This is StreamYard's constant struggle here with their new format. Here it is.
Please, please, please. Yes, please. Listen to me. Yes, please. Peace forever. Peace forever. Peace forever. Esto se llama.
So that is Nicolas Maduro not looking. I mean, there's been a lot of reports of him hiding from bunker to bunker and moving from home to home because he's worried about the assassination attempts. But he's been going live almost every day, even mocking the phone call that he was supposed to have with Donald Trump. I'll just fast forward here.
¿Aló? Bueno, vamos a estar pendiente de esa llamada, Silita, disculpa. Pero es que yo escuché que sonó. No, ahorita no. ¿Ah? What? Mírame.
So that's him, Nicolas Maduro, mocking the threatening phone call that Donald Trump supposedly gave to Nicolas Maduro, as Nicolas Maduro actually said was quite cordial. Ben, how have you assessed Venezuela's response to this militarization and this new Monroe Doctrine? I mean, on the one hand, many have said that Venezuela is on the cusp of collapsing, and on the other, there has been many responses from Venezuela itself, which shows quite the opposite is happening.
Yeah, I will answer that question in a second, but I just want to make a brief note about this phone call that was held between President Maduro and Trump. There have been kind of conflicting reports about this. So we know that essentially Trump just like told Maduro, you need to step down, and basically told Maduro, these are your options. Like they all involve you leaving power or dying. And Maduro said, obviously, no, I'm not going to do that. You're crazy. But, you know, Maduro did say, you know, he's being diplomatic. He doesn't want to escalate tensions. He wants to reduce tensions. Maduro said that it was cordial, but actually Trump was asked about this on the presidential plane by a journalist, and he said that the call went very badly. So we don't know exactly what happened, but obviously we do know that Maduro said no. Like, you can't just, the U.S. is this crazy country that thinks it can just force other leaders around the world to step down, and they'll just obediently do what it wants. And if they don't do it, the U.S. will threaten to kill them. I mean, this is mafia behavior. But in terms of what's happening now in Venezuela, I mean, we have to distinguish, you know, the kind of public-facing messages between what's happening behind the scenes, kind of in private. I know that Venezuelan officials are actually very concerned that they think that any day now the U.S. could launch airstrikes or missile strikes inside Venezuelan territory. And they're preparing for that as a very real possibility. Of course, Maduro does not want Venezuelans to freak out. So he's trying to, you know, keep tensions low and keep morale high. But there's a very real concern that this could happen any day now. And I honestly think it could also happen any day now. Like I said, this is a very serious threat. And it's not just Trump, it's Marco Rubio, who his entire career has been dedicated to preparing for this war to overthrow the Venezuelan government. Now, you know, you and I, Danny, have talked about this in the past. I don't think it's likely that we'll see like U.S. boots on the ground, maybe some special operations forces. The New York Times has reported that the Trump administration is considering that. And this is, you know, the kind of eliticization, the special opsization of U.S. wars around the world, where the U.S. is continuing to wage wars everywhere, but they tend to be low-level wars that are carried out by, you know, these small teams of special ops. So I think that that's certainly a possibility. They may already be in Venezuela. Who knows? We know that in 2020, the U.S. backed a failed invasion of Venezuela with mercenary forces that was called the Operation Gideon. And we know that at that time, there was a U.S. Special Operations officer, Jordan Goudreau, from this mercenary firm based in Florida called Silver Corps. And he trained these mercenaries in northern Colombia. And then they traveled into Venezuela through the Caribbean and tried to invade, but they were caught by Venezuelan fishermen who were part of a union that supported the government. And they told the authorities, and they arrested these mercenaries before they could launch their failed invasion. So We know that there's a precedent of this. I would not be surprised whatsoever if they're going to try doing something similar. But I also think that their strategy is more focused on what the U.S. military's advantage has always been, the most cowardly aspect, which is instead of fighting on the ground, they just bomb you from the sky or send missiles from off the coast from their, these massive warships they already have surrounding Venezuela. So, it is fun to look at those messages, and Maduro is certainly projecting strength and confidence, but behind the scenes they are actually very concerned, and they know that any day now the US could attack, and I think it's certainly a very real possibility. And we talked about why. I mean, anyone who believes this nonsense that this is about drugs, I mean, you have to be a child to believe this ridiculous propaganda. And some of the propaganda we've seen in the Western media is just insanely absurd. And it's so obviously coming from these anonymous US officials who are just fabricating claims like they did with the so-called weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. The Wall Street Journal published one of the most crazy, outrageous stories I've seen in a long time, where they claimed that Venezuela is producing drugs that are then being sent to jihadists in Africa. It was just so crazy, such an obviously fake story, but it's part of this strategy by the Trump administration to portray left-wing governments in Latin America as what they call narco-terrorists, or Trump also calls them narco-communists. Meanwhile, Trump is literally freeing drug dealers, the worst narco leaders in Latin America from prison, and he's allied with the worst drug dealers. Again, it's just this insanely hypocritical cynicism to try to justify this war of aggression. But, again, no one knows exactly what's going to happen here. There is a possibility it could all just be like part of this psychological war, and the U.S. thinks that they can try to threaten Venezuela and scare Maduro to force him to resign. That's, some reports have claimed that. But I also think that this is, again, it's part of this strategic ambiguity where the U.S. may want Venezuela to think that while it's actually planning missile strikes and or airstrikes, which, again, I actually think is not only quite possible, but even likely.
Well, Donald Trump has essentially backed himself into a corner, almost having to do everything that he's done, everything that he said, all the buildup, and the USS Gerald Ford, all of it presupposes the boat strikes that are now coming under major fire for their potentiality. Forget potentiality. They are a war crime, but it's nothing new for the United States. But here's another piece, Ben, that might indicate exactly what you're saying, that something indeed Donald Trump is certainly planning, given that here is what he shared on his Truth Social, an op-ed on Fox News saying Trump's aggression toward Venezuela is a warning to Putin. And in this op-ed, Ben, essentially what this author is saying is that by striking Venezuela, he's going to send a message, just like the national security strategy says, that everything that the U.S. is going to do through the Monroe Doctrine is to prevent hostile powers from influencing or being involved in Latin America. The old Monroe Doctrine, that was European colonizers, in the U.S. being the colonizer that wanted to dominate. Now it appears it's Russia and China that are the hostile powers. So your thoughts on this, Ben?
Yeah, the U.S. as an imperial power has always been very cynical when it comes to this messaging. So when the Monroe Doctrine was first declared, the U.S. government claimed that it was going to help its friends in Latin America resist meddling by European colonial powers, which in reality, we know that the U.S. empire was replacing the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire as the new colonial power in Latin America. But, the U.S. has always had this like fake anti-colonial imperialist rhetoric. And today we see the same thing. The U.S. claims that it's resisting meddling by Russia and China in Latin America, which in the national security strategy, the U.S. repeatedly refers to as our hemisphere. So they're saying the entire Western hemisphere belongs to the United States. From the northern tip of Canada down to the southern tip of Argentina, the U.S. empire wants to control everything, the entire region. And of course, again, Venezuela has been one of the main obstacles to U.S. imperialism in the region. And, you just showed this Fox News report, and it's hilarious. They refer to Venezuela as a Russian client state, which is complete nonsense. It's not a client state. The whole point of the Venezuelan revolution, the Bolivarian revolution, is that they are an independent sovereign nation. They are not a client state of anyone. And Russia has been an important partner of Venezuela. And that's because Russia, which is on the other side of the world, does not have a history of intervening in Latin America and overthrowing independent governments in Latin America and invading countries in Latin America. The U.S. military has intervened in every single country in Latin America, excluding the French colony of French Guyana. But the U.S. military has been present in every single country in the region, most of the time uninvited, with invasions and interventions. And Russia and China have not done that. They're on the other side of the world. It's no surprise that many countries in Latin America have looked to Russia and China as more responsible partners who respect their sovereignty and want to trade and collaborate, because China and Russia do not see any threats in Latin America. They only see potential positive gains from boosting their relations. And I mean, this is a mutually advantageous relationship for both sides, whereas the U.S., I mean, even pro-U.S. forces in Latin America, they sometimes reluctantly acknowledge that, yes, the U.S. treats them as just puppets and vassals and does not respect their sovereignty at all. Everyone knows that. So, I mean, what Trump is doing now is simply taking the mask off of a policy that is literally 200 years old. And this is, of course, under Democrats as well. I was talking about Honduras. The reason that Honduras has been in this crisis it's been in for over a decade is back in 2009, the Obama administration under Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, the two main leaders of the Democratic Party, Obama and Clinton, and then Joe Biden was his vice president. The three main, figures in the Democratic Party, Obama, Biden, and Clinton, oversaw a right-wing military coup in Honduras in 2009 that overthrew Honduras's democratically elected left-wing president and installed a right-wing puppet regime that was run by drug traffickers. And Trump just released the main drug trafficker, Juan Orlando Hernandez, from prison. So again, this is a continuity we've seen for literally 200 years. But the difference is that Trump now is boasting about it. He's proud of it. He's saying, we need to treat Latin America as our colonial backyard, overthrow all of the independent governments, and impose our hegemony. That was also the policy under Democrats. That was also the policy under other Republicans. But, Trump, as this, very blunt, very, vulgar leader, he's proud of it. He's not going to use all of the propaganda marketing that we've heard about, democracy and human rights and rule of law.
Well, isn't it so interesting, Ben? In the national security strategy, it says, we will deny the U.S., that is the Trump administration, non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere. And then this article, as you pointed out, what is important to understand is that Venezuela is a client state of Russia, as is Iran, as was Syria until the recent overthrow of Assad. One by one, Trump has been proving that against American might, Putin cannot keep his sketchy friends safe. And then it even says here,
Danny, keep that up for a second. Go back to that quote.
Yeah. Go ahead.
This is so stupid, and you have to be a smooth-brained idiot to believe this. The idea that, first of all, I already talked about how absurd it is that Venezuela is not a client state of Russia, but it's even crazier to say Iran is a client state of Russia. That is so ridiculous. Iran is a massive country. It's a significant power. And in fact, historically, Iran and Russia have had very complex, sometimes very antagonistic relations. Now they are decently good relations, but even then, there still are major issues between Russia and Iran. For instance, Russia still has pretty good relations with Israel, which, is something that is worth criticizing, but Iran obviously does not at all. Iran has been supporting resistance against the Israeli colonial regime. So, the idea that Russia just controls Iran it's just insulting to one's intelligence. Anyone who knows anything about this region, Iran had a revolution in 1979. They overthrew a U.S. puppet leader, And Iran has been an independent sovereign country. And at some points, for instance, back at, toward the end of the first Cold War, the Soviet Union was much more closely allied with Iran's main adversary, Iraq. Under Saddam Hussein, Iraq was a pretty close Soviet ally. And in the 1980s, Iran and Iraq were fighting a war, and the Soviet Union was actually supporting Iraq in that war. So it's just like, this is the stupid narrative. It's frankly stupid. I'm not even going to be euphemistic. The Western media treats people who read this and watch these videos as idiots, as simpletons, as children who don't know anything about the region, and they make these ridiculous narratives to justify U.S. intervention, U.S. imperialism, saying that any country they don't like is a client state of Russia or China, and therefore the U.S. has to target them for overthrow. But if you know anything about the history of any of these regions, you can see that this is just a childish narrative.
I mean, Ben, it's quite stunning when you put it this way, too, because it completely aligns. If you just go down a little bit from what I referenced to the national security strategy on the Monroe Doctrine, saying we will keep non-hemispheric powers away, we will make sure they don't own anything. It says one can almost see Trump's main Ukraine negotiator, Steve Witkoff, saying to his Russian counterpart, "How's your boy Maduro doing? Seems he having a tough time. Wish we could help." Like this tone, Ben. It is mocking, and it is meant to show how stupid they think we all are. But at the same time, there's just like you said with the Wall Street Journal, there's this complete alignment with how the Western mainstream media talks about all of this, and how the Trump administration, when the Trump administration or any other administration is gearing up for war, regardless of whether they're going to win it or lose it or fail or whatever, it doesn't matter. The Western mainstream media is literally parroting it, sometimes in the most, in this case, the most crude and absolutely ridiculous ways.
Yeah, again, and what's worth pointing out here is this was in Fox News. And if you listen to that tone, I mean, it's actually even worse and even more crude than the tone in like the liberal-leaning corporate media like the New York Times and the Washington Post. But I mean, they all have the exact same line in Venezuela, which is just taking this narrative hook, line, and sinker that supposedly Venezuela is a client state of Russia and or China. And depending on the day, they'll say that Russia controls it, and the next day China controls it, which again just shows how absurd the narrative is. And as I pointed out, the Wall Street Journal claimed that Venezuela is sending drugs to jihadists in Africa. Again, it's just like, it's insulting to one's intelligence, and they treat people as if they don't remember what happened 20 years ago with the Iraq War and WMDs. I mean, maybe some young people don't remember that, of course, but people reading the Wall Street Journal tend to be older. They can probably remember that, but there's this historical amnesia in the U.S. Gore Vidal famously said it was the United States of amnesia, where, you just throw down the memory hole any past atrocity and war crime and war of aggression committed by the U.S. Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Yugoslavia, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Gaza, and now Venezuela. And we're supposed to just forget all of that history. But again, if you know even just a little bit about this history and the U.S. strategy, it reminds me so much of the lead up to the Iraq War, which was for me one of the most influential moments in my life. I was a teenager, and it just it made me who I am. Just seeing how blatantly the U.S. government lied to everyone. It was just so obvious. And then they just invaded a foreign country, just overthrew its government, installed a puppet regime, and then they appointed this random guy from the U.S., Paul Bremer, who didn't speak Arabic. He had no experience in the region, as the king of Iraq. And then he brought in these interns from the American Enterprise Institute to just carry out mass privatizations, Chicago boy style. Just it's just if you remember that history, I don't know how it doesn't just permanently change you, because after seeing that, it's just every other time they've done it, it's so obvious what they're doing. And in Venezuela, I just feel honestly, the propaganda is even cruder. It's even stupider. And it's just even more low effort. But what this shows, they don't really need to manufacture consent, because the U.S. government doesn't need the consent. The U.S. is a regime, it's an oligarchy that just does whatever the corporate, oligarchy wants, whatever these, beltway bandits in the military industrial complex want, whatever these big fossil fuel corporations who want Venezuela's oil are telling the US government it should be doing. And of course, Marco Rubio is he's at the nexus of all of this. He is the poster boy for all of those interests embodied in one person.
Yeah, and we when you were talking about the Iraq situation, we know that Maria Machado is going to the Netherlands, I think it is, to pick up her award. And she recently came out saying, literally, full-scale privatization, please, we need the U.S. to come overthrow the government so we can do exactly what you said happened to Iraq, man. That's exactly the model. But I want to go back to the national security strategy because I think this Monroe Doctrine is really important. This part here just continues to stick out for me because a lot of people are claiming, Ben, that this new national security strategy is a retreat, that it's a retreat away from China, from Russia to the Western Hemisphere. Yet the Trump administration is telling us himself that we are going to deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or threatening capabilities or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere. This Trump-collery to the Monroe Doctrine is a potent restoration of American power and priorities consistent with American security interests. Ben, that's an obvious reference, especially to China economically. We know that Venezuela and Russia have a good relationship, very good relationship, but it's an obvious nod to China. And I'm curious if you can tell the audience because there's always a reason for it. It's not just that the Trump administration wants to stomp around on Latin America just because. There's obviously major reasons for this. And it appears that keeping China and to an extent Russia out of this part of the world is a big reason for it. What's your assessment of that?
Yeah, I read the full document and they make a few points clear. One, that they recognize that in the short term, they cannot fight a war with China. What they don't mention in the report is the U.S. military has done many war games, and in basically every scenario, they lose, or in the best case scenario, both sides lose. But there is no scenario in which the U.S. wins a war with China, especially over Taiwan, because the war would be fought in the Asia-Pacific region, which the U.S. calls the Indo-Pacific region, which is on the other side of the world. It's not like China is going to wage a war on the U.S. and you have to be on drugs. You have to be like, an ally of Juan Hernandez, the Honduran dictator freed by Trump, the drug dealer. You have to be one of his cartel buddies on drugs to actually believe this nonsense. China has not fought a war since 1979. It has no interest in war. So if there's a war, it's going to be in the Asia-Pacific region. The U.S. loses in pretty much every scenario. So the U.S. now recognizes that in the short term, what it has to do is decouple from China, move the supply chains out of the region because they would be destroyed in a war. And the U.S. strategy is to try to move those supply chains into Latin America or the Americas overall, and to have them dominated by U.S. companies as opposed to Chinese companies. And then the U.S. strategy is to cut off any relations in the Americas with China and also Russia, but the priority is really China, as the report makes clear. So you pointed out an important passage of this report where the Trump administration says that essentially China cannot own or control any assets in the region. Now, it's important that they added own or control, right? So China does not own many assets, but they can claim that if China, for instance, has like a minority stake or a Chinese company operates an asset that is owned by a government in Latin America, they can say that, well, China controls it. This is what they've done with the Panama Canal, right? The Panama Canal belongs to the government of Panama. It is not Chinese, period. China does not own it. But they can say that maybe it controls it, supposedly, because a Hong Kong company helps to operate ports on both sides of the Panama Canal, even though, again, it belongs to the Panamanian government, but they have Chinese contractors helping to operate the ports. So again, what this strategy is to cut off all significant relations with China and to a lesser extent Russia. Russia doesn't really have a lot of relations with Latin America. We talked about, Venezuela. Russia does have good relations with Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua, but otherwise Russia's ties with Latin America are not that deep. China's ties are pretty deep. First of all, China is the largest trading partner of all of Latin America when you exclude Mexico. Mexico is the southern U.S. neighbor and they have a free trade agreement. But south of Mexico, China is the number one trading partner, especially in South America. Basically, the farther away you go from the U.S., the more countries trade with China, especially Brazil. Brazil is the largest economy and the most populous country in Latin America. And it also has a massive trade surplus with China, actually. That relationship is very important. We also saw that Trump waged this trade war against China. So what happened is that China, in response, in self-defense, Trump started imposing very high tariffs, as high as 140% on China. So China responded by restricting the import of products from the U.S., of products like soybeans, for instance, which hurt farmers in the U.S. who are a major constituency for Trump. So what happened is that China started importing more soybeans from Argentina and from Brazil. Brazil also, the U.S. and Brazil export many of the same products. The U.S. is the world's largest exporter of oil. Brazil is a major exporter of oil. So beef as well. So essentially what the Trump administration is saying here is that they're going to try to cut off Latin America's relations with China, turn Latin America into like this imperial sphere of influence controlled by the U.S., reshore the supply chain into Latin America. And again, I need to stress this point. When U.S. corporations outsourced their operations and offshored production into East Asia, in the case of first it was Japan, then it was South Korea, then it was China. And in each case, the government of each of those countries had an industrial policy, concerted planning efforts to develop their own local manufacturing with their own companies. So they weren't simply providing cheap labor for U.S. corporations, which means that U.S. corporations would make the vast majority of the profits, and then they would repatriate those profits back to the U.S., and local economies would not see most of the benefits. So instead, Japan, South Korea, and China, in their respective period of industrial catch-up, when they were trying to industrialize, from the 50s to 60s in Japan, the 70s to the 80s in South Korea, and ever since the 90s in China, we saw that each country developed their own local manufacturing with their own companies, so they were no longer dependent on U.S. corporations. So what the U.S. now wants to do is take its supply chain and that production out of China and reshore it into Latin America, but prevent Latin American countries from doing the same. Keep them trapped at the bottom of the supply chain, the bottom of the division of labor, with U.S. corporations exploiting cheap Latin American labor, paying them very low wages, and then overthrowing any independent government in the region that would actually try to pursue an industrial policy, that would try to pursue an independent path, and basically just treat this entire region as like a large neo-colonial outpost of the U.S. empire, create a new supply chain using the minerals in Latin America, which has a lot of minerals. Also, Greenland has potentially a lot of critical minerals, including rare earths. And this is a big reason why Trump wants to colonize Greenland. So basically, the idea is to turn all of the Americas into this new supply chain. And then when the U.S. has decoupled from China, it will be ready for war with China. But again, the strategy makes it clear that China is seen as the biggest threat. But in the short term, they can't actually do something about that. And because they're still economically integrated, and because the trade war that Trump waged against China showed that China has ways to retaliate. China has significant cards, like it restricted the export of rare earths to the U.S., which are needed not only for advanced manufacturing and high-tech products, but especially for the U.S. military-industrial complex to make weapons to prepare for war with China. So quite literally, the U.S. military wants to prepare for potential war with China, but can't do so without critical minerals and rare earths coming from China. So again, this is all part of this larger strategy. And, they recognize that this is going to take probably decades, I mean, I think it's not going to be possible. It's all a pipe dream. But this is how they envision it, which is why in the report they constantly talk about supply chains and preventing hostile foreign adversaries from owning or controlling assets in the Americas.
Yeah, and yet still, Ben, there is major panic about this, and there's also been a lot of people saying how much of a big shift this is in terms of the overall trajectory of U.S. foreign policy. New York Times said Trump's security strategy is focusing on profit, not spreading democracy. His new national security strategy describes a country focused on doing business and reducing migration while avoiding passing judgment on authoritarians. I mean, it just...
This is literally the summary of U.S. foreign policy for its entire history. Like, it's just insulting to one's intelligence to believe, like, this is literally what the U.S. government has done for its entire history. Trump is just making it obvious. Like, he's no longer using the BS marketing, but this has always been U.S. foreign policy.
It's literally what's been happening. The world, as seen from the White House, is a place where America can use its vast powers to make money.
That's literally the summary of U.S. foreign policy for its entire history.
I mean, this is just, and the things that they get triggered by. We seek good relations and peaceful commercial relations with nations of the world without imposing on them democratic or social change that differs widely from their traditions or histories. But what's so interesting, Ben, is that while the New York Times is panicking about this, the Trump administration is seeking regime change in Venezuela, and in the document itself says it's essentially going to assert its power so that it has full dominion over the markets, which necessarily leads to the politics, the governments of the region. I mean, what do you make of this? Because there has been a lot of talk back and forth, because there is a lot of lofty rhetoric in this that says the United States is going to, its core interest is normalization with Russia. It's not looking at China as a competitor as a peer competitor. It's looking at it as simply as economic competitor. Like, what do you make of these rhetorical shifts that have occurred in this versus the reality?
I mean, it's not new, but again, what's different is the forward-facing presentation. The U.S. government has been allied with the worst right-wing military dictatorships in history. Like, you just go down like every single major conflict, the U.S. has been allied with horrible fascistic military regimes. I mean, in the case of Latin America, it's just anyone who knows any basic history about this region knows that basically every single military dictatorship was supported by the U.S. government, almost without exception. Pinochet in Chile, Videla in Argentina. I mean, it's just like you go down list. I mean, Paraguay, Brazil, many countries in Central America, Castillo Armas, Guatemala, Rios Montt. I mean, it's just like, if you know anything about this region, you know the U.S. government has overthrown dozens of democratically elected governments and installed right-wing regimes, typically military juntas, that the U.S. government has propped up. Batista in Cuba, Trujillo. I mean, it's just so insulting. So this idea, again, this is the New York Times narrative, right? Is that the U.S. was this benevolent hegemon. They wouldn't even say hegemon. The U.S. was a benevolent, peace-loving power that supported freedom and democracy and exported fairy dust and rainbows and cookies until Donald Trump became president. And now the U.S. is this evil empire. The U.S. has always been the evil empire. Trump has taken the mask off and is no longer using the childish marketing that these, neoliberals at the New York Times used to just tell themselves at night so they could sleep better, to justify the fact that they were helping the empire justify these imperial wars that killed millions of people in Iraq, in Syria, and Yemen, and Libya, and Gaza. The list goes on, and now Venezuela. So honestly, I do not see a significant break in the foreign policy of the Trump administration. Certainly the rhetoric is a bit different, but we can even see under Biden that it was kind of moving in this direction. Yeah. You can go back to Obama, right?
Right.
Obama was the one who declared the pivot to Asia when Hillary Clinton was his Secretary of State in his first term. And it was Hillary Clinton who tried to have what she called a Russia reset. She met with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister.
She had the button, right?
Yeah, they had the red button that they mistranslated because the people running the U.S. government are actually not as, skilled and knowledgeable as people think.
Nope.
Their Russian experts couldn't even translate a word correctly. So they tried to do the Russia reset to focus on preparing for a new Cold War with China, to isolate China. And then for a variety of reasons that didn't happen, especially because of the US-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014 that set off this war that we're now seeing today in Ukraine that started in 2014 with the US coup. And that led to a significant deterioration of relations with Russia, sanctions on Russia, the annexation of Crimea, the gradual escalation of that war, the expansion of NATO. We all know that story. And then we also saw that the US strategy to overthrow the independent governments in West Asia, the so-called Middle East, it didn't go as well as they had hoped. They thought they could easily overthrow the Syrian government. They thought it would fall as quickly as the Egyptian government. It obviously didn't. It took over a decade of this imperial war that continued under 3 administrations. And then they continued with the war in Yemen, which they also thought, I remember when Saudi Arabia started bombing Yemen in 2015, they literally said it would be a few weeks to dislodge the so-called Houthis, Ansar Allah. That obviously failed. So, the U.S. empire always makes these goals and they often don't accomplish them. The U.S. empire has only been really successful at brutalizing small countries like Panama in 1989, Grenada in 1983, Yugoslavia in the 90s. These are relatively small countries. Iraq is a bigger country. The U.S. kind of failed there, but at least they overthrew the government. But when they're dealing with a big country like China or Russia, come on, obviously they're not going to be able to accomplish those goals. But what they can do is just cause a lot of trouble and destabilization, especially in the periphery of these countries, like we see in Ukraine. So getting back to, the Western media's narrative about this national security strategy, they're still dealing with the shock of the fact that the U.S. has been gradually moving out of Europe. But again, we saw the same thing in the Biden administration. Yes, the Biden administration did obviously flood Ukraine with weapons to continue propping up this regime in the proxy war against Russia. But they also made it clear that their priority was moving toward the Asia-Pacific region to prepare for conflict with China. This has been a thread that has continued ever since the Obama administration, from Obama's 2 administrations to Trump 1, to Biden, to Trump 2. So rhetorically, yes, there are differences in this report. For instance, one big difference is this culture war nonsense that we're always beaten over the head with by both Republicans and Democrats, but especially Republicans. And there are these stupid lines in the report, about how Europe is going to face civilizational destruction because of immigration, which is, a repackaging of this white nationalist racist narrative that brown Muslims are going to destroy Europe. And they call it what was this stupid term?
White genocide? The white genocide? Is that what it was?
No, but yeah, that's even stupider. But they called it Eurabia, I think, right? 10 years ago,
I
this is
heard that
stupid
one.
narrative, Eurabia. And it's just this is so, at this point, we've heard this nonsense for well over a decade. And it's just part of this culture war for these right-wing parties to distract from the real problems that people are facing, which is unaffordable housing, unaffordable living costs, inflation, all of these issues that we see in the US that are even worse in Europe. And Trump literally tells people that they're just making it up. He says, one day he says, well, it's the Biden inflation. And the next day he says, no, actually, things are great. Everything's affordable. There is no cost of living crisis. Meanwhile, inequality is skyrocketing. Billionaire oligarchs are getting richer and richer. And we're seeing it in all of these Western societies, since the neoliberal era of capitalism, with the complete destruction of state capacity and the privatization of everything and the deregulation of the financial sector, what we're seeing is the immiseration of the working class, and a small handful of corporate oligarchs have gotten richer and richer and are exploiting society and controlling the political system and buying off politicians. And there's no public investment, and education is collapsing, and healthcare is not being funded. So what do? They just scapegoat immigrants. This is the same old tired strategy. The Trump administration says, that Europe is destroying itself not because Europe has subordinated itself to the US empire, has cut off Russian energy, is now antagonizing China, one of its leading trade partners. Europe is also continuing to subordinate itself to the US at a time when the US is publicly attacking it. Kaja Kallas, the de facto foreign policy chief of Europe, she was asked about this report, and it's like she's self-flagellating. She said in response to the report, our relationship with the US is our most important relationship, and we continue being committed to deepening our partnership with the US. I mean, it's like you're in an abusive relationship and your partner is telling you that they hate you and they don't want to be with you anymore. And then you say to them, no, but I cannot live without you. I have to continue with you. This is what Europe is doing to itself. And then what the US says, it's because of immigrants. It's because of Muslims. Again, it's just like the stupidity of all of this. Like, you have to ignore all of the context and not know anything in order to believe this nonsensical narrative, like the idea that the US is attacking Venezuela because of drug trafficking, when in reality, the US is supporting the worst drug traffickers on earth and releasing them from prison. Again, it's just like everything, it's just like the stupidity of it is incredible. And this is what the US government has been doing for many decades. But now they've just taken the mask off, and Trump has shown the true face of it.
Careful, Ben. Victoria Nuland did actually pass out cookies, so perhaps there is something to this. Actually, what the U.S. was doing before Trump was passing out cookies and coloring rainbows, and going around the world spreading the most happiest of democracies. But yeah, no, I mean, this is just it's absolutely absurd what's going on. But Ben, not this. I'm curious on your thoughts on this, because you mentioned earlier that the U.S. often has a difficult time with bigger countries. It's right now it is essentially saying in this national security strategy, Russia and China, there cannot be a big war, even if they pivot to other areas like Latin America, where isolating China from there is a big part of it. But is the U.S. right now underestimating the sovereignty of Venezuela right now? I'm curious on your thoughts about this, because there's been many developments. I know that the government has been arming people, training people. There's obviously a level of confidence. I mean, you have people clubbing to that song that we played earlier. I can pull that up really quickly. Are they? I mean, there they are. I mean, that people are clubbing to the song. I'll just play it really quickly. I mean, there's obviously a big sentiment that does not support what the U.S. is doing in Venezuela, and you've been there many times. Talk about, is there an underestimation that's going on too of the U.S.'s ability to dictate terms to even a country like Venezuela, which I can bet a lot of money that it's seen as low-hanging fruit here.
Yeah, the U.S. has no ability to dictate terms to Venezuela, which is why they're resorting to military threats and attacks. So in terms of the situation in Venezuela, a country I've been to many times, and I speak fluent Spanish and know many people there, and I'm in constant communication with them. The reality is that, yes, Venezuela internally is very divided politically. No one disputes that. And certainly there are people in the country who hate the government, but there are also a lot of people who support the government strongly. And there are, even just aside from people's views on the government, there are a lot of people who are willing to fight for their country because they see these U.S. attacks on Venezuela not only as aimed at overthrowing the Venezuelan government, which it obviously is, but also at basically colonizing Venezuela. And there are a lot of nationalists in Venezuela who will fight to protect their homeland and their natural resources, which belong to them, not to ExxonMobil and other U.S. corporations. In terms of the Bolivarian militia, this popular militia that the government has been helping to create and train people, this is not new, actually. I remember when I was in Venezuela in 2019 during the last coup attempt that Trump carried out during his first term, when Trump tried to impose this right-wing, little-known opposition figure, Juan Guaido, as the fake interim president of Venezuela, despite the fact that he had never participated in a presidential election. I remember at that time, They already had this militia because they were concerned about a potential invasion then. And by the way, we know from media reports that Marco Rubio, even though he was not in Trump's first administration, he was sometimes meeting with Trump and giving his opinion and, advising Trump. And Rubio was pushing for a U.S. invasion of Venezuela during Trump's first term. So we obviously know that he's now pushing for it again in Trump's second term, now that he's the second most powerful person in the Trump administration. And so this militia is not this, Bolivarian popular militia. It has been around for several years, but we've seen reports that hundreds of thousands of people have been signing up. And I absolutely believe this because I know people who have said that they will pick up arms and fight if the U.S. attacks them. In terms of the political views inside Venezuela, first of all, the oligarchic right-wing opposition has been extremely divided for many years, but at this point, it's just completely disorganized, and almost all of the major oligarchic right-wing leaders are living abroad. Most of them in self-imposed exile. Leopoldo Lopez, who's from one of the richest families in Venezuela, who used to control the country and its oil. I mean, this is why the right-wing oligarchs in Venezuela are so extreme and so violent and so willing to use any measure, including war and U.S. invasions, to overthrow the government. It's because they, before the Bolivarian Revolution, controlled Venezuela's oil and controlled its natural resources. They treated the country as their personal piggy bank, and they were extremely rich because of that. Not because of hard work, not because of entrepreneurship and innovation, none of that nonsense. Venezuela has been a petrostate for 100 years. Before Hugo Chavez was born, Venezuela has been a petrostate. And before the Bolivarian Revolution started, when Chavez became president through democratic elections starting in 1999, before that, Venezuela had a two-party dictatorship like the U.S., what they call the Pacto Punto Fijo, a two-party dictatorship where the two parties, they would change power every few years, like the Democrats and Republicans. And in Venezuela, one faction of the oligarchy would come into power, and then they would use all of those natural resources as their personal piggy bank, and then they would lose power, and the other faction of the oligarchy would do the exact same thing, rinse, repeat. And these are the people who are desperate to get back in power. And they're all related. It's extremely incestuous. So Leopoldo Lopez Mendoza is his other last name, from one of the most powerful oligarch families in Venezuela. He is related he's the cousin of the Halverson family, who are another oligarchic family who are very influential in U.S. politics. Thor Halverson has this fake human rights organization that is working with the Trump administration. And then you mentioned Maria Corina Machado. She would most likely be the de facto leader of Venezuela if the U.S. can overthrow the Venezuelan government. She has vowed to carry out mass privatization. She's a huge fan of Ayn Rand and this libertarian brain slop that melts your brain. And she has vowed to do mass privatizations of everything in Venezuela, which she claims is worth $1.7 trillion. And she is the cousin of another oligarchic family, including the Neumann family. Machado is also from a very wealthy family. They're all oligarchs. They all want to get control of these natural resources so they can profit from them personally. They'll sell them, of course, to ExxonMobil and Chevron, but then they'll take, a 5 or 10% cut. That money will not go to the Venezuelan people, who will be left to suffer. So given that history, yes, there are some right-wing oligarchs who hate the government. There are some of them still in Venezuela who hate the government, but they only represent a small minority of the population. And then there are a lot of poor and working class Venezuelans who make up the majority of the population who still do support the government, because despite all of the many problems that have gone on in Venezuela in the past decade, primarily because of the illegal U.S. sanctions and blockade that starved Venezuela of the export revenue that it got from oil. According to the top UN expert on sanctions, Alina Duhan, the Venezuelan government lost 99% of revenue because it was unable to export oil, and it was unable to import the technology and the naphtha and the lighter crude that it needed and the chemicals that it needed in order to process and refine its own heavy crude in Venezuela, which made it basically useless. And they couldn't export it because of the U.S. sanctions. and then they couldn't import the technology, and they needed to repair and update their oil infrastructure because that was mostly made by US companies and European companies, and the sanctions prevented them from doing that. And then international insurance companies and shipping companies didn't want to work with Venezuela. You know, like all these issues that Russia has faced. Russia is a major world power. Russia has been able to get around the sanctions because essentially it's shown that it's too big to sanction. Whereas Venezuela's largest trading partner was the United States historically. So the US was suffocating this country. Yet despite that, there still is a lot of support for the government among poor and working class Venezuelans because it's the only government in the modern history, in the entire history of Venezuela, that has given them free education, free healthcare, free housing. More than 5 million housing units have been created since the Bolivarian Revolution started under Hugo Chavez and was continued by Nicolás Maduro. It's the first government that actually used the natural resources of Venezuela to benefit the majority of the population. And it's been endlessly punished by the US for that. So the US thinks, in its arrogance, as always, that these foreign governments have no public support. That they thought the Syrian government had no support, the Libyan government under Gaddafi had no support, and they can just overthrow it, and then they'll just put in a puppet, and everything will be fine. Well, as we see in Libya, it is very much not the case. Libya is still at civil war that the US started in its illegal NATO regime change war in 2011. And then Syria's government is overthrown. And now look at the disaster Syria's in. I mean, it's run by the former leader of Al-Qaeda, who was part of ISIS, who is, you know, a Western puppet. And yet he's hated. He was not elected, by the way. He's a dictator. So the US does not care about democracy at all. You know, Ahmad al-Shara, this, you know, former Al-Qaeda leader in Syria, there was not a single person who voted for him. And it's just like, it's a nightmare in Syria. It's an absolute nightmare. So the idea that the US has that Venezuela would somehow be like this great libertarian utopia run by, you know, Ayn Rand fans who just sell everything off to US corporations, it's actually quite likely that you'll see another Libya or another Syria in the northern tip of South America, right in the Caribbean, close to the United States. So after the US destabilized North Africa, which led to the weapons that the Libyan government had spreading all across the region because the US destroyed the Libyan state. So all of these Salafi jihadist groups got access to all of these weapons, which went to Boko Haram and other, you know, extremist groups across Africa. Meanwhile, in Syria, the exact same thing happened. It became the epicenter of Salafi jihadist extremists from all around the world flooding to Syria, which now run the country. This destabilized Europe because it led to this mass refugee crisis that far-right parties in Europe profited from by scapegoating refugees and immigrants for everything, not mentioning that the US and NATO and European countries were responsible for that crisis through their wars of aggression and regime change wars. Now the US, and in all of its brilliance, is doing the same thing right in its own so-called backyard, according to their colonial rhetoric, in its own so-called hemisphere, according to their own colonial rhetoric. They're going to create a Libya, you know, several hundred, a little over, but close to the United States in Venezuela, if they succeed in overthrowing the Venezuelan government. Because I've said this multiple times, and I will repeat it. I think it's very unlikely that the Venezuelan government will fall unless the US government actually directly wages war, bombs Caracas, destroys significant infrastructure, potentially kills Maduro, which is a very real possibility. That's why I actually think that you know, certainly Rubio is pushing for this very hard, and I think Trump could give a green light to that because
it would be ridiculous. It would be crazy. That would be crazy. But continue. Yeah. That would be a disaster. So many people are going to die with that. Yeah.
But the idea that they have is that after that happens, they just install Edmundo Gonzalez as the fake president, and the real president behind him would be Maria Corina Machado as his vice president, but she would be the real leader. You know, like Dick Cheney was the real leader. You know, Bush was just the, you know, front-facing marketing guy. Machado would privatize everything. U.S. corporations will buy everything. The Venezuelan people will just sit on their hands. Poor and working class Venezuelans will accept the fact that all of their resources are being sold off to ExxonMobil and U.S. mining corporations, and they won't do anything. No, there will be a civil war. If the U.S. assassinates Maduro and overthrows the Venezuelan government, there will be a civil war. Period.
Yeah, and we know that one of the big reasons why the U.S. has had such a hard time with a more preferred kind of decapitation, just deinstalling or deposing of someone like Maduro, is because the military actually is quite loyal, quite in solidarity with the leadership of Venezuela. That's nobody wants to say it, but it's only been this way since Hugo Chavez. Ben, I wanted to talk about, as we maybe this could be our last segment, about the national security strategy. This does almost feel like we are going back in time about some odd 50 years. Even Pete Hegseth had this to say, where he literally compares Donald Trump to Ronald Reagan. And a lot of these policies in Latin America actually are directly connected to those policies. Here we go.
They're dead wrong. Most who invoke Ronald Reagan's name today, especially self-styled Republican hawks, are not much like Ronald Reagan. The policies they've championed are nothing like his. In fact, for the better part of 30 years, they've been quite the opposite. If you look at actual policies, Donald Trump is the true and rightful heir of Ronald Reagan. It's President Trump.
So he is the rightful heir, Ben, Donald Trump. If you look at his policies now, I just want to go back to the national security strategy, because I think a big part of this strategy is rebranding war. I got to remove this video, of course. Rebranding war in a way that, let me just, here we go. Rebuilding war in a way where the United States is relying on, whether it's in Europe, it's European so-called allies. They're supposedly going to burden share over there against Russia. And then with China, even, the U.S. is going to build a military capable of denying aggression in the first island chain. It cannot and should not have to do this alone. Our allies must step up and spend, and more importantly, do much more for collective defense. Its diplomatic efforts, the United States should focus on pressuring the first island chain allies and partners to allow the military greater access to their ports and facilities, to spend more on their own defense, and most importantly, invest in capabilities aimed at deterring aggression. This will interlink maritime security issues along the first island chain and reinforce U.S. and allies' capacity to deny any attempt to seize Taiwan or achieve a balance of forces so unfavorable to us to make defending that island impossible. Ben, it really does feel like rebranding. And when Hegseth says this is, Trump is the kind of heir to Reagan, a lot of this Monroe Doctrine rehashing and wanting to create these kind of proxy states that are in a state of civil war, using absolutely illegitimate forces to do that. It appears that's the Trump administration's strategy. What's your take?
Again, I honestly think it's absurd that people keep saying that this is like some break with the history of U.S. foreign policy, and this is a completely different strategy. I see so much continuity between what Trump is doing, what Biden was doing, going back to even Obama. Like, you can see the evolution of U.S. foreign policy from the pivot to Asia. Like, this all really started with the pivot to Asia. And actually, if you want to go back even further, you can go back to the Bush administration. And before 9/11, the PNAC, the Project for the New American Century, the original neocons who populated the Bush administration, and then many of them were brought back in Trump's first administration. Let's not forget, for instance, John Bolton, the ARC neocon, he was the national security advisor in Trump's first term. Now, the national security advisor is Marco Rubio, another lifelong neocon. Of course, Mike Pompeo, another neocon, was Trump's CIA director and then Secretary of State. And now Trump's Secretary of State is the neocon Marco Rubio, who is both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. So, going back to PNAC, for instance, I was going to mention that in the Bush administration before 9/11, they were also preparing for a pivot to Asia. They recognized that China would be the next, target of the U.S. empire, because the U.S. empire always has to have an enemy. It was the former Soviet Union. Then the Soviet Union was overthrown in 91. Then it became, Iraq in the first Gulf War. And then it became, non-state terrorist groups. And then it became, especially after 9/11, the war on terror, the invasion of Iraq again, war in Afghanistan. And then, it kind of transitioned a little bit after the wars in Libya and Syria. Then it became kind of more Russia with the war in Ukraine and the coup in 2014. But always in the background was China kind of being the main target. And basically what the Trump administration is saying with the strategy is that, one, they've been too distracted in Europe and have dedicated too many resources to Europe, and Europe should defend itself and pay for its own protection, which is not new. Trump was saying that in his first term, and Biden didn't say it publicly, but it was essentially what the Biden administration was doing as well. I mean, they were giving weapons to Ukraine, but they were also basically continuing with Trump's narrative that Europe should pay more in NATO spending and should also provide more support for Ukraine because the U.S. wanted to pivot to Asia, which goes back to Obama. And then the other major message that we see here is that the Trump administration says in the national security strategy that it wants to deprioritize West Asia, the so-called Middle East, which again, that goes back to Obama. Obama famously said, we want to end the war in Iraq. He also claimed he would end the war in Afghanistan, which he did not do. But he said they wanted to withdraw forces from West Asia and South Asia and focus on East Asia, focus on the pivot to China. And the Biden administration also did carry out some of that. For many of the infinitely bad things that the Biden administration did, like, the genocide in Gaza, to name just one example, the Biden administration did actually withdraw from Afghanistan, which Obama did not do, and Trump 1 did not do. The Biden administration withdrew from Afghanistan in order to prepare for conflict in what they call the Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific region with China. So again, there's this narrative that we see that corporate media outlets are trying to manufacture, that Trump represents this massive break and he's completely changing U.S. policy. But again, it's actually following a pretty logical line of evolution going back to Obama and the pivot to Asia. Now, in terms of Europe's role in all of this, one of the differences, it's not the strategy itself. I mentioned that Biden was already doing this, but there's the culture war element, right? It's that the Trump administration doesn't like Europe because there have been these centrist neoliberal governments in Europe that they've also waged their own culture war. And well, the standard of living of people in Europe has collapsed for average working people because these European oligarchies run by a bunch of, millionaire bankers and corporate elites, they have completely abandoned the working class. In France, we see Emmanuel Macron is literally a banker. We see that in Germany, the right-wing chancellor right now, who, by the way, is kind of pro-Trump. This idea that they're all anti-Trump is absurd. Friedrich Merz, the chancellor of Germany, was the literal head of BlackRock's German arm. He is the representative of Wall Street in Berlin, which is the most powerful country in the European Union and the de facto leader of the EU. In Italy, you have this far-right Mussolini fan, Giorgia Meloni. But before her, they had a literal banker from Goldman Sachs, Mario Draghi. And then in the UK, until recently, now you have this cardboard cutout puppet leader who doesn't do anything. But before that, you had Rishi Sunak, who is also a Goldman Sachs veteran, and he returned to Goldman Sachs, working on Wall Street. He had 800 million pounds of wealth, nearly a billionaire. So, Europe is, and look at Canada, by the way, also run by Goldman Sachs, former head of the central banks of Canada and England, Mark Carney. All of these Western governments are oligarchies run by a bunch of corporate elites from Wall Street. They've totally abandoned their population in the working class. But to distract people from that, they also engage in the culture war, just like the conservatives, right? The culture war blame everything on immigrants and Muslims and Latinos in the U.S. And in Europe, these liberal forces, they also have done the same thing in the opposite direction, saying that, we support refugees, we support immigrants. The conservatives, they all hate refugees and immigrants. They're all distracting people from the fact that these corporate oligarchs are just sucking out all of the wealth, destroying their countries, deindustrializing their countries, and leaving behind just like this financialized economy that is entirely dependent on Wall Street and capital flows from this transatlantic capitalist class that does not care about its country, that does not invest, that does not pay taxes. Like, that is the real issue in all of these countries. Like, you cannot understand anything that's happening without understanding how, like, this neoliberal era of capitalism has completely destroyed the social safety net, has destroyed the social contract. Now AI is going to lead to mass unemployment. Like, these corporate oligarchs in the financial sector and big tech do not care about the people of their country, and they are destroying the economy. And their plan is to all move to eventually Mars when Elon Musk can do that. But in the short term, well, they all have their bunkers in New Zealand, and they have their
Colorado, in the mountains of Colorado.
They bought their citizenship in Caribbean islands. Like, they are destroying every country where the government is allowing them to do whatever they want. China doesn't allow this. Russia doesn't allow this. These Western neoliberal regimes do allow this. And then they distract everyone with this culture war. And you read this insane national security rhetoric. This is in the National Security Report, and they make it about the culture war. This shows how much this has infected every aspect of politics, distracting us from the real national security problem, which is this financialized, deregulated capitalist system. That's a real national security threat. The US can't make anything because the capitalist class decided that it doesn't matter if you make potato chips or computer chips, it's all the same. And it doesn't matter if you can produce anything, because all you need in your economy is the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate. All you need is Wall Street. And then, Silicon Valley can make its AI models, but you don't need to actually make any of the technology. You just design it, and it's made abroad. That was the neoliberal model that the capitalists in the US and Western Europe, they're the ones who decided to do that. It was not China who forced them to offshore production to China. They wanted to exploit low-paid workers in China. And yet now we're supposed to blame China for all of this, for this decision that was made by these corporate elites that were being encouraged by the government because they control the government. Everything else is a distraction. That is the fundamental contradiction. And now these same corporate elites, their solution is war with China because they don't want any competition. Well, their first solution is to ban all Chinese competitors. Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, which is hemorrhaging money, they cannot compete with Chinese competitors, which are all releasing, these Chinese AI models are all open source. So they're begging the US government to ban all of their Chinese competitors. The Biden administration already banned Tesla, protected Tesla by banning Tesla's Chinese competitors, by putting 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, after Elon Musk publicly called for tariffs on Chinese EVs. It wasn't even Trump who did that. It was Biden who did that to protect Tesla from Chinese competition. And now they're doing the same thing for AI. That's their strategy. And then their strategy eventually is preparing for war with China to destroy any competitors so they can continue with this model that has immiserated the large percentage of working class Americans and now working class Europeans. And they don't want to reverse course. Their only solution is war. So what they're doing in the short term is creating the conditions to decouple from China. They're not going to bring that manufacturing back to the US. If you believe that, again, I have a bridge to sell you. Their strategy is to offshore that manufacturing to Latin America, to Mexico, to Brazil, to Argentina, and even to lower paid areas, Central America, where they'll have the lowest end of the value chain, which will be run by US corporations. Their plan, which they think they can accomplish, I don't think this will work. They want to recreate an entire new supply chain with critical minerals in the Americas, excluding China, and create Fortress America, all controlled by US corporations. those manufacturing jobs are not going to the Midwest. They're not going into the United States because these corporations don't want to pay livable wages. And then when they've done that, which is not going to happen, but they think they can accomplish it, then they can prepare for war with China to destroy any competitors to U.S. monopoly capital. That's the strategy. Like, and it's not even a new strategy, but again,
No.
Trump has just made it very obvious.
Yeah, it's a total continuation. Isn't it so interesting, Ben, that it's the old Marxist adage that the economic base is what truly actually lays the foundations for how the state operates. And here we have everything that you just described, the financialization, and then of course monopoly, the concentration, the constant, incessant concentration of wealth and capital. That is happening politically at the same time. I mean, this is what Trump is actually, and this is what Biden. There was never a time, I don't remember. It's such an interesting rebrand and a spin to say, well, Russia was never the U.S.'s interest. That was Europe's interest. This like whole war thing with China, it's not really our interest alone. It's Japan's, it's South Korea's, it's Taiwan, that little island over there that's China's. That's actually China. It's never been the U.S. is just going it alone. Every single administration since Reagan and before that have always wanted to rely on those that they seek to dominate, their so-called allies, so the U.S. can cement its monopoly over not only the economy, but that you need political and military monopoly to have an economic monopoly. And it's just so interesting that this is being viewed as a retreat when in fact it is an attempt to concentrate U.S. power. That's not a retreat. That is concentrating more and more. It's an attempt to concentrate more and more dominance in a time where even the Trump administration in this document had to admit that's not really the world anymore. It's the world that they certainly want, even though they're saying they don't want it, but it's the world that they want. So, it's mind-boggling. And there's this whole process going on the opposite end, politically and around the world, multipolarity, which is the opposite. And economically, you have these countries, China, Russia, and the rest in the multipolar world, that are advocating not for an economic, political monopoly. They're seeking to actually open things up and to have different ways of governing, different ways of developing economically, so that they can actually get out of this misery that the U.S. unipolar model is causing. It's just so interesting that this is seen as a break when in fact it's not a break. It's just a new spin. Your thoughts, Ben?
Yeah, this is the fundamental contradiction that we see. It's just, we are in a multipolar world. It's become uncontroversial to say that. Even like the Munich Security Conference, their last report was titled Multipolarization. I mean, this is like a NATO-backed group. So everyone recognizes that. So within that new scenario, how do you slightly modify your strategy in order, because the U.S. strategy is global dominance. It still is. And the Trump administration can deny that, but for rhetorical reasons, for their, America first base. But it's still that is what the strategy is. And simply what they're doing is, in the short term, they have to change the priority in order to prepare for the medium to the long term. And the fundamental contradiction is, in this multipolar world, China has risen as the largest economy on earth. Ever since 2016, when you measure China's GDP at purchasing power parity, it's the largest economy on earth. I was even surprised to see in this national security strategy, they acknowledge this. There's a part where they acknowledge that when you measure GDP at purchasing power parity, the Asia Pacific region has the majority of the global economy. They say that in the report, which is an acknowledgement that the economic balance of power, the economic weight of the world, has shifted from the transatlantic region, when, North America and Western Europe, the colonial powers, dominated the entire world following World War II. This is before formal decolonization of the global South, of Africa and Asia at least. And it was when these were the only major industrial powers. It was even before Japan's industrialization, It was before East Asia became the world's factory. That has all shifted. The economic weight of the world is now firmly in Asia, which, by the way, makes sense because the majority of the world population lives in Asia. That's how it should be. So we are coming out of a time where the West dominated the world for centuries, since the rise of European colonialism, and decolonization efforts from the 1950s and the 1970s led to the formal end of colonialism. And yet you had neo-colonialism through financial and economic means of imposing colonial control over countries in Latin America and Africa and some parts of Asia, through US-dominated financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, through the US dollar, which is still the most powerful weapon the US has. You know, today we've mostly been talking about kind of geopolitical and military strategy. We don't have time to get into the economic and financial strategy. That is still one area where the US actually does have a lot of power. Whereas, you know, militarily, the US can't defeat Russia. We've seen that in Ukraine. And the US now recognizes that it can't win a conventional war with China, which is why it's resorting to kind of more indirect tactics. Economically, let me take that back. Not economically, financially, that is still the most powerful weapon the US has. It has a lot of power financially. But, you know, that's a whole other issue, getting into de-dollarization and the shift in the global financial system. But the point is that the global economic balance has fundamentally shifted, and the US is trying to find a new strategy that recognizes that, so the US can leverage its power in order to divide Asia, to weaken and destabilize China in order to reassert global dominance. And the strategy that they've come to is strategic withdrawal from Europe and basically colonization of all of the Americas, turning all of the Americas into Fortress America, this imperial sphere of influence, creating an entire new supply chain, dominating all of the critical minerals and other strategic resources in the region, and then using this to reshore production, to move factories out of Asia and into the Americas, into Latin America, and then to target the Asia-Pacific region for destabilization. Another quick point, we haven't talked about India. And, you know, Trump has publicly criticized India, and he put 50% tariffs on India. But the report makes it clear that India is still a key ally of the US. And this is why I've always been hesitant to say that, like, and in my analysis, I've always clearly said that in the short term, Trump has done damage to the US-India relations. And India does have a non-aligned foreign policy. I've always maintained that India is not just going to obediently ally with the US and do what Washington wants. However, I've always been clear to emphasize that India still is an ally of the US, and it's still going to maintain good relations with the US. And this idea that, like, India is just going to ally with China and Russia against the US is very naive. It's not going to happen. India is going to maintain a non-aligned foreign policy. When it's in New Delhi's interest, they will lean toward Russia. When it's in their interest, they will lean toward Washington. And this report makes it clear that they still see India as a strategic ally to counterbalance against China, to try to weaken China. So none of this is off the table. Like, it's so clear what they're doing here. And it's because they recognize that, you know, some like MAGA supporters, they point to the fact that the US recognizes that we're in a multipolar world as supposed evidence that the US no longer seeks domination. Right. But no, that's not the conclusion. The conclusion is that the US, that imperial strategists in Washington recognize that we're in a multipolar world, so they have to change their strategy to seek domination, global domination. That still remains the priority. Right. And what they have to do is, in the short term to the medium term, change their priorities, focus on imposing hegemony in the Americas, dividing Asia, strategic rapprochement with Russia in order to reduce tensions with Russia. They know now that they cannot divide China and Russia as Trump had hoped that they could. That's not realistically going to happen in the short term. So by reducing tensions with Russia in the short term, coming to a conclusion in the war in Ukraine, in the medium term to the long term, they hope to improve relations with Russia, improve relations with India, and hope that over time they can gradually try to isolate China, decouple economically from China, create new supply chains, and prepare for a war with China in the future, some kind of larger conflict. I mean, this is the new Cold War, right? Like in the first Cold War, largely because of nuclear weapons, but also because of the size and geostrategic significance of the Soviet Union, and especially, in the 50s and 60s, the Soviet Union was a major technological power. They were the first country to send a satellite into outer space. They were the first country to send a dog, and then a person into outer space. Like, the Soviet Union was a major technological power. The idea that the US would win the space race and the technological race with the Soviet Union was not clear in the 50s and 60s. And by the 70s and especially the 80s, the Soviet Union was entering, a period of decline. This is what the US strategy is for China. Like, they think that they can recreate this global architecture in Cold War II. We're in the second Cold War. Everyone knows it. It's now openly admitted in Washington. They cannot wage a direct frontal war with China, just like they couldn't wage a direct frontal war with the Soviet Union. So instead, their strategy is a war of attrition, a geopolitical war of attrition. And eventually, if they can succeed, which I think they're not going to succeed at all, but if they think that if they can succeed in weakening and destabilizing China, they can reimpose hegemony like they did in the 1990s.
Yeah. I mean, it's this is a very interesting moment, Ben. I mean, I really find it fascinating that we have this idea that there is now a full-scale retreat from the United States because of the publishing of a document, when everything you just said demonstrates that the multipolar world isn't something the U.S. wants to embrace. Acknowledging something like the multipolar world is not something that's this is an empire of lies, yes, but oftentimes the oligarchs, the warmongers, oftentimes they say things that have truth to them. I mean, after the fall of the Soviet Union, yeah, Fukuyama, that was ridiculous, the end of history or what have you. But the sentiment was that the United States was the only superpower left in the world after the fall of the Soviet Union. That had a lot of facts to it. And what did the U.S. do? They acted on it. The imperialists, the empire, they went absolutely, completely unhinged and, went on trying to overthrow every single government left that was weaker and vulnerable. And that's the history. So this is not something new. Acknowledging a multipolar world doesn't mean there's some kind of reversal. This means simply that there's an acknowledgement that how the U.S. Tries to get to global dominance or to maintain it or to expand it, has to look different or has to be different. It doesn't mean that it's going to change necessarily. I had one audience question for you, Ben, if you have anything you want to respond to.
One quick note, Denny.
Yeah, sure.
Can you go to page 23 of the PDF of the report, which is 19 of the report?
Yeah, let me pull it up
Page
again.
23.
Let me get it.
Yeah, this is a section titled. Yeah, do you have it open?
Not yet. I have to get the document back up because I closed it. Where is this thing?
Yeah,
Where is this? No, it's okay. You can continue to comment while here it is. It's all the way on. Okay, here we go.
Yeah,
okay,
page 23 of the PDF. I think this is a good note to conclude because it's just like, for me, it summarizes everything and how people are really misinterpreting this document, probably because they didn't actually read it, or if they did, they read the bullet points. So if you go to page 23 of the PDF,
which one?
Okay. Go page 23. You're on 27. Page 23 of
23. Not the literal 23.
Of the PDF. Yeah. It's 19 of the. Okay. This section is titled Asia, Win the Economic Future, Prevent Military Confrontation. Go down a little bit. This is just proving the point that I've been arguing here. All right. No, go back. No, go up. Okay. It says in the second paragraph there. Okay. Here. The second paragraph in the middle. It says, I'm reading here a quote. It says, which means that, quote, the Indo-Pacific is already and will continue to be among the next century's key economic and geopolitical battlegrounds. To thrive at home, we must successfully compete there. And we are, end quote. There we go. I mean, that line just says everything. They have acknowledged that in the short term, they cannot win a war with China. It would be destructive. It would be catastrophic. Economically, the U.S. is too interconnected with China. They have to decouple. They have to create new supply chains. The U.S. military-industrial complex literally cannot create the military equipment needed to wage a war with China without Chinese critical minerals, especially rare earths. However, they say openly, for the next century, in the Indo-Pacific will be the key economic and geopolitical battleground. We are competing there, and we will continue to compete there. Period. I mean, like, I don't know how people can read this. Again, they're not reading the report. They're only looking at the bullet points. But that line just like, we know what they're doing. And the idea that they're withdrawing is just false. If you read their document, it says clearly they are planning for the next century to compete with China, as they put it, which is a new Cold War. We're in Cold War II. And in the medium to the long term, they are preparing for a potential military conflict with China, or at the very least, they say economic and geopolitical conflict with China.
Yeah, exactly. Let's pull up the one audience question as we close here, and then I'll pull up the rest of the super chat.
Yes, that's right. They are into Africa. The French, having been ritually humiliated in Niger, in Mali, and in Burkina Faso, have decided that a coup in Benin is a step too far. With its ultra valuable coastline, its port, and its capital city, recently adjudged the most beautiful capital city in Africa. Well, it isn't so beautiful this evening because the French Air Force are bombing the army of Benin in their military base. They say that the coup that was mounted overnight and was revealed to the world this morning by a group of junior officers is over. It's finished, except we haven't been allowed to see their puppet president, if he's safe and still in control. And the leader of the junior officers is broadcasting constantly on YouTube. And if it's over, why are the French still bombing it? Even worse, Macron phoned his boyfriend, Tinubu, the former drug dealer in the United States, now the octogenarian stooge of France in Nigeria, and told him to start bombing his neighbor too. And he did it. More than that, he's mobilizing the Nigerian army to invade his neighbor Benin. That's the Nigerian army that cannot protect the Nigerian people from the Boko Haram terrorists. That's the Nigerian army, which has lost control of much of its own country's territory to a group of ISIS-inspired fanatics, Christians, Muslims, being slaughtered every day by Boko Haram. But where is the Nigerian army? It's bombing and about to invade Benin. Now, I don't know anything about the junior officers that mounted the coup, but everything I've learned in the last 12 hours, 18 hours, tells me they've got a point. Any president that requires the bombardment of foreign air forces of his own capital has already lost. Even if he emerges, and he has not emerged since last night, no sight of him has been caught by anyone. No still picture, no moving picture, no words on a microphone, nothing. And the people of Benin are voting with their feet. They have poured onto the streets of the capital in their thousands, if not tens of thousands, to back the army revolt. We'll keep you posted. And a man who knows more about Benin than me, Jackson Hinkle, is my first guest this evening. So you'll be very well educated on Benin this evening. More importantly, got to say, no disrespect to Benin, the United States is now in a state of war with Europe. That's the only way you can interpret the events of this week. The new National Security Survey of the United States writes off the European Union, writes off the possibility of new enlargement in NATO, writes off any possibility of American forces ever entering Ukraine, and writes off the chances of any European country that tries to do so in its stead. And that was only Wednesday. Then on Friday, a war of words erupted after the European Union fined Elon Musk, one of the confidants of the American president, £150 million for refusing their bid to try and censor X users across the European Union. In the 48 hours since, X has become the number one
International
source
order
of
is very
news
clear.
in
These
every single European Union country. Everyone has X as their number one source of news. So the European Union has picked a fight with the continent's number one provider of news. And it's not going well for the European Union. The Russian negotiator, Kirill Dmitriev, put up a poll. What is the problem with the European Union? Should we start again with the European Union, or should we back the bureaucrats? The bureaucrats mobilized 50,000 bots to distort the outcome of the poll, but they haven't noticed our poll. And wait till you see the results of that. Everybody knows that these unelected tyrants, elected by no one, accountable to no one, removable by no one, earning a king's ransom, even when they're not pocketing the money of the European taxpayer in corrupt practices. You'll recall the Belgian Serious Crime Squad raided the European Union headquarters in Brussels just this week and arrested and detained some of the biggest panjandrums in the entire European Union, including the previous Foreign Minister Mogherini. The alleged fraud comes to hundreds of millions of euros over decades. Hundreds of millions of euros fraudulently obtained, it is alleged, by panjandrums of the European Union. It is the sick man of Europe. The EU is the sick man of Europe. The most corrupt country in the EU is the European Union Commission itself. They have destroyed their own societies, their own cultures, their own economies. They have left themselves friendless throughout the global south, throughout Eurasia. And if the French got a chance to reinvade Britain after 1066, trust me, they would take it. They are trusted by nobody except the credulous Chinese fans, only fans in the world, who think that Napoleon Macron is somebody worth taking a selfie with. And he's not even trustworthy in China. The Chinese went a bridge too far in welcoming Macron, but no sooner was he back in Paris, he was threatening China with tariffs if they did not correct the trade imbalance. the trade imbalance is because of this, Mr. Macron. Nobody in China wants to buy anything from you, but everybody in France wants to buy something from China. It's called capitalism. You, as a former banker, I won't mention the name of the bank, you, as a former banker, I said, should know about capitalism and how it works. Well, Musk didn't take it lying down. 150 million pounds for refusing you access to our back door, if you'll forgive the pun, so that you could spy on ex-users in the European Union. 150 million pound fine so that you could spy on people, so you could censor people, so you could identify people that needed to be spied on, that needed to be censored. No thanks, said Musk, who does quite a bit of censoring of his own. And that's usually to do with the bastard child of Israel. But he's not prepared to be censored himself. He's not prepared to be censored by the European Union. And so the EU's own advertising portal on X was promptly banned. And Musk embarked on what can only be called, if he'll forgive the phrase, a jihad against the European Union, calling for its abolition, as any sensible person would do. And he's not without friends, because within minutes, the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, waded into the row. He condemned unreservedly the EU's attempt to hamper the free trade, to hamper the business of American tech companies, and has demanded that the European Union reconsider. Well, will they reconsider? If they reconsider, they're only confirming who is the daddy. And it ain't Macron, it ain't von der Leyen, it ain't Callas. The daddy is in Washington. If they don't reconsider and abolish the fine, the American administration itself will go to war with them. If they're lucky, it will not be a hot war. But the United States has many levers that they can use against the European Union, composed as it is of some of the most failing societies, failing countries on planet Earth. Countries that are in a slough of despond. Germany, which just introduced conscription, the first member of the European Union so to do in this crisis of NATO versus Russia. The French people, the British people who are not in the EU but might as well be. We've done nothing good with the Brexit that we worked so hard to achieve, and we are now shadowing every single move of the European Commission, except when we are doing more, worse, and faster and harder. So the peoples of the European continent, including Britain, are in this slough of despond, despair. They look at their societies and they don't recognize them as the countries that they grew up in. They don't recognize a Europe that only a few years ago, under Borrell, was claiming to be the garden and describing the rest of the world as the jungle. And now they see that the garden is ruled by the gargoyles within. Now they can see that the people in charge of European destiny are not fit to run an escargot stall. They can see the failing, fading, flailing leaders, most of them almost down to double digits to single digits. All of them are in double digits. All of them are less than 20, but most of them are hovering around 10% of public opinion approval in their countries. So, you know, it's never been truer what I've been saying to you for years, that the sun is rising in the east, and it sure is setting fast in the west. And of course, that's before we come to the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war is now motoring to a conclusion, brokered by a right-wing Republican president, Donald Trump, and the Russian Federation itself. Ukraine are not even at the table. The European Union have been banned from the table. At least Zelensky will get allowed to come to the table to sign the final agreement, but the Europeans will not. So they have spent hundreds of billions of euros and pounds in a Ukraine war that is about to end without anybody giving them the time of day, without so much as a by your leave. How's that for a record of failure? The Russian armed forces are now advancing at such a pace you can't keep track of them. I used to send out, retweet military maps of the front as it changed. For a long time, not nearly enough of a change. It's now the case that the map is no longer relevant or valid or applicable the moment that it is drawn. Before the ink is dry on the latest military maps, Russia has advanced and substantially advanced still further. It's only the first week of December. The Russians in the Zaporizhia region have advanced by 85 square kilometers. And that's just in that one region. Right across a 1,000-mile front, the Ukrainian forces are deserting, are surrendering, are escaping, and so they should, and I hope that they will in increasing numbers. Who wants to be the last man to die for the chiseling little crook of Kiev? Zelensky, who's only measuring the airplane he's going to escape from and with, to see how much of his ill-gotten gains he can cram into the hold. They are revealed to be the criminals that we said they were right from the start. And the New York Times that called us Putin apologists, reading Putin speaking notes, being mouthpieces for the Kremlin. The New York Times is saying exactly this day what I've been saying to you these years. The Economist, the Financial Times, the Telegraph even, and even Rupert Murdoch's Times are all telling you the war is lost. And it's been lost not just from without, but from within. The corruption of the Zelensky regime has destroyed any possibility of a state of Ukraine of any kind with any borders emerging from this bloody imbroglio that should never have started in the first place back in 2014. And the vultures are hovering. Did you know that there never was a Ukraine? Did you know that the USSR created Ukraine, made it a constituent republic of the Soviet Union, took other people's territory and gave it to that artificial state of Ukraine? Poland owned for centuries the western part of Ukraine. Lvov, if you've ever been there, is as obviously Polish a city, and the language being spoken there is Polish. The Carpathians were stolen from Hungary. Other parts were stolen from Romania. By the way, whatever happened to those Ukrainian rent boys that set fire to the Prime Minister's houses and cars? Why is nobody paying any attention to that case? Why has it been kicked into the summer of next year before it comes to trial? And why is nobody investigating just who these men were and what their relationship to the British Prime Minister was. If you know anything about this case, you only know it from me. And that tells you the liars that have been lying to you about Ukraine right from the beginning are continuing now, most of them, to be stumm, as the Churchill of the 21st century will be lucky to escape prison, be lucky to escape in an airplane. So I say again, who wants to be the last man to die for Volodymyr Zelensky? Not many takers for that one. I'll be right back. Stay. US-based political analyst and the host of the wonderful show on which I'm shortly to appear myself, Legitimate Targets, joins us now. As this breaking news comes in, Jackson, a sixth bombing raid by foreign air forces on Little Benin and its beautiful capital city. Doesn't sound to me like the coup is over. What do you think?
Well, thanks for having me back on. Yes, this was a really shocking day. We woke up this morning with the news that there was a coup underway in the country of Benin, the coastal country of Benin, which is extremely important to the rest of the Sahel Alliance states, the AES states, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, because it would give them unimpeded access to a major port in the Sahel area. So this was shocking to me. I didn't really know what to make of this coup that took place in the early morning hours, because sometimes these African coups take place, but it's actually the French that are backing these coups and they want to shift around the leaders. But it appears as though this was an entirely real sovereign effort led by the Lieutenant Colonel Tigri in Benin. And within a few short hours, we had the airwaves, the national TV broadcast airwaves, taken over by the coup leaders. There was about 13 men that led this effort, all of the military. And not too long after that, we received all of these French-based reports from AFP and other French outlets saying that the coup was over. And that was in the very early morning hours. Again, I want to stress that. That was a long time ago. They claimed the coup was over. Everyone had been arrested. Some people were even saying that these coup d'etat leaders had been killed in the clashes that were ongoing in the capital city. That turned out to be a bunch of lies because, as you just said, there were 6 airstrikes in the capital, at least 6 bombs that went off. Local sources are saying that it sounded quite clearly like airstrikes, and it would make sense because not only has there been a French surveillance aircraft above the capital city in Benin all day, but there were 3 Nigerian aircraft that entered into the country and were circling over the capital city during the time in which these loud explosions took place. I would presume that they were trying to locate and then target the coup leaders. Some were saying that these coup leaders were on the run. Again, some were saying they were arrested, and some of the other ones were on the run. What we do know is that the Lieutenant Colonel Tigri, who led the effort, was not arrested in the early morning hours. He made a statement late in the afternoon saying that he demanded the supporters of the coup to get out in the streets and protest against the French-backed president. And a lot of people did do that. So it's very, very disheartening to see that Nigeria is taking their dictates from a random white guy in Europe who has an approval rating of like 5% amongst his own population. And they're doing his bidding by now going and airstriking, presumably, innocent people that are just fighting for their sovereignty in another African nation. We also saw today that ECOWAS, which is an imperialist tool in Africa, and the African Union, another imperialist tool, both condemned this coup effort. But I fully stand by it, and I hope for the best. I hope that they make it out alive, and I hope that they are able to assert sovereignty in Benin once more.
And of course, the puppet president has not been seen, has he? Not a still, not a video, not a word on the radio. That doesn't sound like someone who's firmly in power, does it?
Of course not. It sounds like he's trapped like a rat somewhere in the capital city. Whether he's trapped by his own security forces or whether he's trapped by the coup leaders, I guess, has yet to be determined. But you would think that if this coup failed and everyone was arrested, you would have at least someone from his administration who would have come out on national television and said that simple fact, given a statement. But all that we saw was the interior minister from the Talon government, who's the former or current president, depending on how you look at the situation. He went out on private TV airwaves, not the national syndicate that was taken over in the morning by the coup leaders, and he gave a statement. And as for the president, you're correct. No one knows where he is. No one has seen him. There hasn't been any phone calls from him, any media appearances, any videos, nothing whatsoever. So I guess we're still waiting for the answers on that.
And what do you make of this, Tinubu? The Nigerian armed forces are being offered help from Donald Trump. So difficult are they finding it to protect their own people from ISIS and its chapter there, Boko Haram. So the Nigerian military can be spared to go and attack their neighbor, but they can't keep peace and stop ISIS in their own country. What kind of president is that?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, Tinubu has very long-standing ties in the United States. Max Blumenthal and David Hundeyin, who's the latter is a Nigerian journalist, very famous, did a brilliant piece on Tinubu in the Gray Zone. Everyone should read it, about Tinubu's ties to cocaine trafficking networks in Chicago in his earlier years. So this is the type of guy that we're dealing with, in bed with the CIA, in bed with all these drug narco trafficking units. But of course, the West backs up the real narco terrorists like Tinubu, who, as you point out, are ignoring, I would say, the assault on their sovereignty by Western-backed terrorists like Boko Haram. Also now, JNIM, another terrorist organization linked with Al-Qaeda, has also entered into Nigeria. They have been causing a lot of chaos in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger the past few years. And what is the goal here? Well, the goal is to try and take as many of the resource-rich regions in these countries, in particular in Nigeria, and the U.S. will cry foul. They'll say that Christians are being genocided, even though Christians and Muslims are being killed in both very high rates. Actually, far more Muslims are being killed than Christians in Nigeria. And then Eric Prince or some other private military contractor will get to send in their mercenaries to Nigeria, and they will take up all of the resource-rich land, the mineral-rich land, the gold-rich land in Nigeria, and illegally steal all of the resources. As for the question of why can't he do anything about this threat in his own country in Nigeria, but he launches all these airstrikes or these planes in Benin the moment there's a coup, there's a simple answer for that. President Macron of France gave a call to Tinubu today under the guise that there was a new offensive led by the Boko Haram terrorists in Nigeria. He made an emergency call, and apparently it wasn't about Boko Haram, because if it was, I'd imagine those fighter jets would have been used to do targeted airstrikes, hopefully on the terrorists, but instead they were used to go into violate the sovereign airspace of Benin and presumably strike the coup leaders.
Now, as you mentioned, Marco Rubio and his administration are again steaming towards Venezuela. The Dwight D. Eisenhower aircraft carrier has withdrawn from port in the last few hours and begun steaming towards the Caribbean. The shills of Narco Rubio are trumpeting that it's on. that Operation Southern Spear against Venezuela is on. Is that your take? And what's likely to happen next?
Well, I'll just say it's incredible. Laura Logan, who is a Trump insider, very close with all the Trump administration bigwigs, is, as you just said, tweeting out that Operation Southern Spear is on. This is the U.S. Illegal war that they've been drumming up for months now, or 7-8 weeks now at least. And tomorrow in Caracas, I believe, because what is today? Is today the 7th or the 8th? So it's on the 9th and the 10th, we're going to see about 5,000 to 6,000 people from all across the world standing in unison with the Venezuelan people travel to Caracas and participate in 2 days of major events to try and voice their opposition for this illegal war, which is a total sham if it's being under the guise of combating narco-terrorism for many reasons. But of course, the biggest and most recent reason of all is Trump just pardoned Juan Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, who is sitting in a U.S. prison cell for the next 45 years as a result of his involvement and directing of a massive narco network out of Honduras while he was president. So I can't believe that they would begin this operation right now at a time when 5,000 to 6,000 people from all across the world are going to be there. I wish I was there with all of them right now. I wish I was in Caracas. I know we have some mutual friends that are there. And all I got to say is I'm praying for everyone's safety, the Venezuelans and those who are traveling there in defiance of the U.S. Warhawks.
Well, that's two big enchiladas. Let's go to the biggest of the enchiladas, the current state of affairs in the NATO-Russia war. I've been listening all day to Donald Trump Jr., for example, who's a remarkably eloquent critic of the Ukraine. He said, and I quote, Ukraine is fantastically more corrupt country than Russia. I've been listening to Tucker Carlson saying he hopes to go back to Russia because the last time he was there, I can only describe it as magnificent. The statement even of General Kellogg, who's on his way out, all seem to indicate that the Americans are going full steam ahead to get a framework to bring the war to an end. Meanwhile, the yapping and deeply unpopular dogs of war in the European Union bark pointlessly away. That's the optimistic outlook, and I happen to share it. What do you think?
Well, I'll first say that the I guess early departure of General Keith Kellogg is something that I am very happy to see, and I think it's a strong indication that we're headed the right way with regard to settling this madness with Russia. Before Trump was elected and before General Keith Kellogg was promised a seat at the table in these Ukraine negotiations, I read his book on what an America First Trump policy would look like with regard to Ukraine. And it was as bad as I read it several months ago or a year ago now. Back then, as we all see it today, you know, it's not really a plan for peace. This was a plan for escalation. And at the time, I contacted the few Trump officials that I knew, people who I presume would be in the administration, and made a strong case that he not be hired. So I think this is the 100% correct direction. I'm labeled as a Russian puppet. You're labeled as a Russian puppet. So what that really means is we tell the truth about what's going on. And if our enemies like Kellogg are on the way out, that's a good thing. As for the military front, you said it better than anyone else a few moments ago. Every single part of the front line is going in Russia's direction right now, and it's not by any small margins. The Russians in Zaporozhye are collecting about 100 square kilometers each and every week. And that's just a small part of the front. You look at what's happening in the Kramatorsk-Slavyan salient. It's forming into a semi-encirclement of the last major Ukrainian defensive and the largest Ukrainian defensive position that they have in Donetsk. And even in the north, in the Kharkov region, you see the Russians moving forward, which looks like they're going to collapse all the way over to Izium, moving even west of the Oskol River. So this is a very, very difficult situation for the Ukrainians. And I would not be surprised if Zelensky is going to be on his way out very soon. I don't know where he'll go. Maybe Israel, maybe Miami, if Trump is gracious enough. But I really can't imagine that he's going to last too much longer, because the cards are all falling and none of them are in Zelensky's favor. I am worried about who they're going to try to replace him with. This Zelensky character that London is propping up is talking about nukes for Ukraine, NATO for Ukraine, all the same old stories. And I think we need to have real elections in what remains of Ukraine. It can't be London propping up another war hawk. But for everyone who thinks that this is going to end with some negotiation, I think that you're missing the big picture here. This war is already coming to a close, and it's with a Russian victory.
And of course, the analysis that we have consistently made, which got us branded and labeled, is now the analysis of the New York Times this day. It's the analysis of The Economist, the Financial Times, even the Telegraph, even the London Times. So they've caught up with us. I suppose we should sing hallelujah, but it would be nice to get an apology, wouldn't it, Jackson?
Well, look, our only crime was that we were 4 years too early to the truth. And being 4 years too early to the truth does not get you $30 million investment deals like Pierce Morgan, I guess, is now vying for. So that's the price we pay. But I think you are as happy as I am that we pay that price and we don't sacrifice our spine in the process.
Absolutely. That's Piers Morgan has valued his show at 115 million pounds sterling. So that's what, 130, 140 million US dollars. And he's trying to raise 30 million to market his show more. I'm on the lookout for someone that would do that too, Jackson. If you ever come into money, son, I'd love to go to business with you. Thanks very much, as always, for your expert analysis. A man so young and yet so wise.
Commander visits Somalia to call for the intensification of war against the ISIS affiliate in the area. Now, I know what some of you all might be thinking. Yes, he went to go visit Puntland, and yeah, Puntland just happens to be where a lot of gold is. And yeah, Puntland is also where a lot of the black market gold is sold to the UAE. But that doesn't mean this meeting wasn't totally and entirely about liberating Somalia from ISIS. It could totally just be coincidental that the majority of the strikes from the U.S. have already been in Puntland, and ISIS just so happened to show up where all the gold is. Yeah, no, it's probably not coincidental. Now, the U.S. wants troops on the ground in the region because that part of Somalia is not actually part of the U.S.-backed federal government's control. And we know how the U.S. operates. If they're going to steal your resources, or if their allies are going to steal your resources, you have to be under their control, or they have to destabilize you. So, you know, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, some affiliated group shows up to your region, cause a bunch of havoc, and now the U.S. has a reason to bomb the shit out of your country, because the only way that you can save anybody is to bomb them into oblivion. Oh, but what's happening in Somalia, and specifically Puntland, is the perfect imperialist scam. You see, it just so happens that Somalia owes a shit ton of money to the UAE. Now, the reason they borrowed this money from the UAE was to build infrastructure, necessary infrastructure, for Somalia to thrive, and thrive using its own resources, in which case they would use the money they gained from rebuilding their infrastructure to pay back the UAE. Now, if ISIS enters your country and starts destroying all the infrastructure that you borrowed all of this money to build, Well, how are you going to use the money from the infrastructure that you were supposed to gain to pay back the country you owe? The answer is you can't. So you start making some backroom deals. Given all the money you owe, you're persuaded to expand your political relationship with UAE so that it doesn't look suspicious when everybody finds out that most of the gold stolen and sold on the black market, specifically from Puntland, goes to the UAE. And the United States and the UAE being good allies as they are, of course the UAE can count on the United States to put some ISIS affiliates wherever needed so that that gold can be stolen and sold. And the US itself has interests outside of gold in Puntland, given that there's some very suggestive evidence that there are a lot of untapped lithium deposits. And the US needs that, considering that it's losing the contest against China regarding the lithium race. But sure, I'm entirely positive that this is totally about terrorism and not destabilizing the region. Once again, it's probably just coincidence that another area that happens to have a lot of resources just happens to have an ISIS affiliate in which the US is now using as an excuse to be there, and then the US and all of its allies get rich off the resources of that region. Once again, probably just coincidence.
Currently underway in Benin. Yeah, we back. Yeah, we back. Now, today we're going to be talking about the ongoing situation currently underway in Benin. As you know, a small nation on the West African coast. And of course, I definitely got love for Benin, the ancestral lands of Toussaint Louverture, the ancestral lands of Dessalines' mother. So, when it comes to me, I definitely got a certain attachment to Benin. So earlier this morning, around 4 a.m, I was up late night making videos, doing my thing. And then my phone started blowing up. My email started blowing up. The phone started blowing up. Even in my comment section, people are hitting me up. So I go search what's going on, right? Then I see the headlines. Soldiers in Benin claim they have taken control of the country in a coup. Take a look up on the screen. Soldiers in the West African country of Benin said on state television that they had ousted the nation's president and taken power in an apparent coup on Sunday. Lieutenant Colonel Tigri Pascal was named by the group, which calls itself the Military Committee for Refoundation, as the transitional leader, according to the reports. Now, of course, when it comes to me, I never jump out on day one. When it comes to situations like this, you always got to wait and see. You always got to wait and see how the situation develops. And you can't jump out on first day. You got to wait at least a couple weeks, a few months before you really can say, okay, they have taken power, right? That's when you can really say they've taken power. Because unless you have everybody on board, 9 times out of 10, there's going to be a counterattack, right? And you have to prepare for the counterattack. You can't just prepare for the operation where you take power and think we just going to be, chilling in power. No, you have to prepare for the counterattack that is absolutely going to come unless you have everybody on board, which is usually not the case. And that's why, going back to the brothers in the AES, when you really think about the fact that they've been able to hold on to power, not only against the several counterattacks that have came, but also the slander and the propaganda in the media. That's also another form of counterattack, and the sanctions and the border closures and the intelligence operations and all the things that have came their way, and even threats of military intervention, and they still remained in power after multiple years. And now with the modern day, they are regarded as the legitimate sovereign leaders of those nations, undisputed, uncontested. So that really goes to show that it wasn't just a fluke operation where they winged it and got lucky. And the reality of situations like these, when you undertake these operations, is that you have to be prepared to die. You have to be prepared that they might kill me, right? I might die in this operation, right? The government forces, the forces loyal to the head of state, they might launch the counterattack. And I'm definitely going to jail for sure. I'm definitely going to jail forever, but I definitely might die. You have to accept that fact. Once you accept the fact that you're going to die and you're cool with that, then at that point, you just got to take whatever comes with it because you made your final decision. That's the reality, especially when there are so many foreign interests, domestic interests at play when it comes to geopolitical situations like these. Now, when it comes to the president in Benin, when it comes to me, I'm not a fan of any head of state that is hosting French military personnel on your territory. I'm not a fan of any head of state that invites French generals to their presidential palace. I'm not the fan of any head of state that allows the French intelligence to operate bases and operational hubs inside your country, right? So when it comes to the president of Benin, got no love for him. Got no love for Patrice Talon, right? Got no love for him. Yeah, you a sophisticated black man and all that nonsense, but at the end of the day, brother, I don't respect you. And that's another thing too. When I seen that the coup d'etat was underway in Benin, the first thing I thought of was like, damn, man, you know how much French military personnel is in the country, right? The French Air Force is all over the country. They got an aircraft carrier in the harbor, the French intelligence all up in the country. I was like, damn, these guys are undertaking a crazy operation, right? Because you literally have the adversary inside the country. It's not like the adversary is all the way, in his country where it's going to take him some time to react. He's already in the country. He's already in the skies. He's already in the harbor already. So when I seen that at 4 a.m, I was like, damn, man, them boys got some balls, man. Them boys got some courage for that. Them boys real for that. But I was like, damn, I was going to sit back and wait and see before I say anything. I don't want to make a statement. We have to sit back, wait and see. That's what I always do. Sit back, relax, and see how the situation develops. Now, a couple hours after the initial announcement, we started seeing headlines coming out saying this. The authorities in Benin say that the coup attempt has failed and President Talon is safe. That came from the French media, right? And we know the French media is owned by the French government. So this came from the French intelligence. So the French intelligence started putting out headlines saying that, listen, the president is safe. Everything is all good. Everybody don't panic. French interests are still secured, right? But a few hours after that, we started seeing ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. And we know the current leader of ECOWAS is President Bola Ahmed Tinubu of Nigeria. And they put out a statement saying this: the Commission for the Economic Community of West African States has received with consternation reports of an attempted military takeover in the Republic of Benin. We strongly condemn this unconstitutional move that represents a subversion of the will of the people. We call for the full respect of the Constitution, and we salute the efforts of the government and the Republican Army in bringing the situation under control. We hold the leaders of the plot, both individually and collectively, responsible for any loss of life and property occasioned by their actions. We will support the government and the people in all forms necessary, including the deployment of the regional standby force to defend the Constitution and the territorial integrity of Benin. So the French media immediately came out, listen, everything is safe, everything is secured. But then ECOWAS made a statement saying that we are ready to deploy the regional standby force. So then I was like, wait, if everything is all good, everything is secured, why are you talking about, intervening militarily? And if you remember back in 2023, when the military took over in Niger, you saw President Tinubu of Nigeria doing similar activities. Take a look up on the screen if you remember. Nigeria's President Tinubu seeks the support of the Senate for an intervention in Niger. Tinubu is seeking the support to intervene against the ruling military in Niger, where a coup removed the democratically elected government. The West African bloc activates the standby force for a possible intervention. And you remember back during that time, I was doing the live updates, right? Every single day. I was sometimes 2 times a day, right? The 10th of August, they activated the so-called the standby force, saying that we are going into Niger, guns blazing, to restore democracy, right? And it was like a staring contest. Like the government in Niger called their bluff. They were like, listen, do it. I dare you. I dare you to do it. I dare you. But then you remember, like 1 week later or 2 weeks later, take a look at this headline. Niger allows military troops from Mali and Burkina Faso to enter its territory in the case of an attack. So what originally began as an attack against one government, one individual, now you had the prospect of an entire regional war, right? So now it's like, boom. If we go into Niger, now we have the governments of Mali and Burkina Faso. They said that they're also going to come into Niger guns blazing to shoot back at us, right? So now it became a whole different scenario. You're talking about an entire West African war. The Pan-Africanists on one side and the Western assimilationists on the other side. And of course, the plan was called off. Nobody ever came in. Nobody invaded. Everybody just went back to doing what they was doing, right? But could you imagine if President Tinubu actually invaded and actually removed President Chiani from power? That would mean that the French would still have the uranium mine still to this day. They would be still pillaging the uranium still to this day. They would still be paying pennies on the dollar for the uranium still to this day. right, they would still be getting money under the table still to this day, right? And the French economy might not actually be, suffering as bad as it is right now, still to this day, right? So, man, could you imagine how different things would have played out if our brothers did not come to our defense, right? Could you imagine? Could you imagine? But President Chiani, he understood, listen, I can't stand by myself, right? Because he was sanctioned by the entire world. The entire world sanctioned him, right? Every country in the European Union sanctioned them, right? The border closures, man, it was crazy. They couldn't get medicine into the hospitals. Folks were dying in the hospitals. Listen, they really put the pressure on President Chiani. That's why I say it's one thing to take power. It's a whole different thing to actually hold on to power and maintain. They tried to break President Chiani, but by the grace of the forefathers and the ancestors and the foremothers, it didn't work. He's still standing. But man, they really tried to break him. They really, bro, it was elderly people in the hospitals dying because of the sanctions, bro. It was so crazy. But anyway, something else that really questioned my thoughts on the situation, because they said that the situation was under control. President Talon is safe. Everything is all good. But like we said, we saw ECOWAS coming out saying they're going to militarily intervene. And then I seen one of the leaders of the operation actually come out and make a statement saying that, calling on the French government not to intervene and things like that. So I'm saying, if these guys claim that everything is under control, then why are we getting so many conflicting messages? But anyway, I'm going to play the clip of one of the military leaders, basically telling the French government, don't intervene, right? Stay in your lane, things like that. But anyway, run a clip. I'll be right back.
I am Colonel Tigri Pascal. Since this morning, we have launched an operation to liberate the Beninese people from Patrice Talon's dictatorship and the freedoms he has long stripped away from them. We invite you to lend massive support to our action, and we call upon the French government not to interfere at all in the internal affairs of our very dear country, the People's Republic of Benin. We call upon the French government not to interfere at all. We call upon the French government not to interfere at all.
Now, like I always say, man, it's one thing to take power. It's a whole different thing to maintain power. And as the situation was developing, I seen some French journalists saying things like this. As a coup attempt unfolds this morning in Benin, a French army surveillance aircraft has been circling for over 2 hours in the skies above the capital of Cotonou. Patrice Talon's government announces that it has thwarted the coup d'etat, while the leader of the mutineers, Lieutenant Colonel Pascal Tigri, calls on the population to support him. So we have two conflicting messages. We have the leader of the operation calling on the population for support, which is also a tactic of the AES. When the leaders in the AES came to power, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, besides the fact that they were moving as a unified bloc, they also had the support and backing of the populations. So if a foreign power wanted to militarily intervene, you were not simply going up against the military regime, you were also going up against the population that was pouring into the streets by the thousands and thousands standing behind the government. So are you going to attack all the thousands and thousands of civilians as well? So it put the opposition, the adversary, in a strange predicament. Am I going to fire on women and children and pedestrians and civilians to restore democracy? Right? So obviously, those are the two main things you got to have. You got to have some allies on deck. Before you launch any operation like this, you have to have some allies on deck. And I believe that President Chiani, before he launched his operation, he had some allies on deck before he went and did what he did. I think he already, spoke to the brothers down in Mali, spoke to the brothers in Burkina, and they was like, listen, it's a go. You got the green light. That's what I believe. I don't have any proof. I'm assuming that's what it was, because if you remember, when the French were kicked out of Mali and Burkina, where did they go? They went into Niger. That was currently under the administration of the former president Mohamed Bazoum, right? So obviously that was a threat to the interests of Mali and Burkina. So I don't know for sure if they had any involvement in the military takeover that happened in Niger, but I'm sure they were definitely in support of the removal of President Mohamed Bazoum's administration due to the fact that he was hosting French troops right along their border. And what happened? What did the French do when they got kicked out of Niger? Where did they go? They went to Benin. They got kicked out of Mali and Burkina. They went to Niger. They got kicked out of Niger. They went to Benin. Now, I've been tracking some of the flight activity, some of the aircraft activity that's been happening in Benin this morning, and there's so many aircrafts in the sky right now. That's something else you have to have under control as well. when the brothers in the AES came to power, they shut down their airspace. You have to shut down your airspace, bro. You have way too many planes in the sky. There's so many planes in the sky. And yes, the French Air Force is in the sky right above the Capitol. As you can see, the French Air Force, the Beach King Air 350, French surveillance aircraft in the sky in Benin right now as I'm recording, and along many other aircrafts as well, right? And take a look up on the screen. The good brother David Houdain, he said this: I have just received word that the Nigerian army formations at the Ojo Barracks in Lagos are preparing to stage an illegal invasion of Benin as soon as tonight. For the second time in 3 years, the drug pusher, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, wants to start a war in West Africa. SOS to whoever still has a brain in Abuja. And as you can see, an unknown aircraft has entered Benin from Nigeria and is currently heading towards the capital of Cotonou. And as you can see, another unidentified aircraft flying from Nigeria into Benin. Seems like it's also headed towards the capital of Cotonou in Benin. Man, them boys didn't shut down the airspace. Them boys didn't shut down the airspace. It doesn't seem like they had any, pre-positioned allies before they launched the operation. Man, it seems like them boys didn't do their proper planning, man. They didn't do their proper planning, bro. Damn, it seems like these boys winged it. It seems like they winged it, but damn, launching a coup d'etat when the French troops are already in the harbor, that's crazy, bro. Listen, y'all got some balls for that. Just for that alone, your name's going down in history for launching a coup d'etat with French aircrafts already in the sky. Like, listen, y'all real for that. But if you notice recently, I don't know why, because Nigeria has no connection to France at all, right? But as France has begun to take geopolitical losses in Africa, for some reason, they've decided to strengthen their relationship with Nigeria, right? Nigeria don't got no connection with the French sphere of influence. I don't even understand this relationship and why Nigeria is attaching itself to a dying empire, right? A state that is on the decline, right? A state that is on a downward trajectory. Why are you linking up with somebody that's fallen off? I don't understand it. You Nigeria. You're supposed to be big man Nigeria, and you linking up with some old has-been that fell off and ain't doing nothing no more. Old, washed up, old bozo. You linking up with him? Currently in France right now. All the big men that pay all the taxes, they're looking at different places to live. They're trying to relocate and send their money overseas to different tax havens and relocate to different countries. Go to Dubai, go to the United States, go to Luxembourg, go somewhere else, right? The rich guys, man, they don't care about France no more, but you linking up with France and strengthening your relationship with France, somebody that is on the decline, somebody that is on a downward trajectory, a downward spiral, stop it. I don't know what kind of blackmail they got on President Tinubu. I don't understand it, bro. I don't understand it, man. But anyways, the good brother David Houdain, he posted this image on his social media. Attention, Nigerian military, your lives have value. You swore to protect Nigeria and defend the sovereignty of Nigeria. You did not swear to die for nothing or to serve a white man in Paris. The neighbor is not your enemy. And something else as well. You notice how back in Guinea-Bissau a couple of weeks ago, there was a so-called alleged military takeover in Guinea-Bissau, which I already did a video about that on the Patreon. That was fake, fraudulent, counterfeit. You know why it's fake? Because the members of the current government, the new administration, right? The military takeover, it's the same members of the previous government, right? It's because the president, it was an election. The president was going to lose the election. So all of his entourage, they organized the fake coup d'etat so they don't have to acknowledge the results of the election. So the guys that were already in power, they're still in power. They just have a different face as the figurehead. But the finance minister, all the ministers, they still in power, right? They still in power. They didn't leave. So you noticed how nobody was talking about military intervention in Guinea-Bissau because the same guys that was already in power, they still in power. So nothing has changed. Nothing has changed geopolitically. That's usually one of the main ways that I judge the authenticity of a military takeover is how the international community reacts, right? For example, when the brothers in the AES came to power, there was an immediate reaction and condemnation when they came to power. They were talking about military intervention. They were talking about international sanctions and blacklists and all type of craziness, right? So that lets me know if a military takeover actually threatens the interests of the current social order. If the military takeover does not threaten the interests, then you will not see anybody talking about military intervention, the restoration of democracy. It'll be like in Guinea-Bissau. It'll be like in Gabon, right? You notice how the president of Gabon, who also came to power in a military takeover, he was acknowledged by the United States government. Anthony Blinken came to see him. Trump invited him to the White House. Macron just visited the country, right? Because his military takeover, he was the cousin of the previous leader. So the same family is still in power, which means the same interests are still protected. So nobody's calling for the restoration of democracy or military intervention or bloodshed or anything like that, because he did not change anything. Nothing fundamentally changed. But when you actually come to power and things are fundamentally changing, right, and interests are currently being placed in jeopardy, that is when you'll see, violent and, immediate visceral reactions from the international community. And it'll be immediate reaction. They're not going to waste no time. As you can see in Benin, they're already bombing the goddamn military barracks in the capital. The good brother David Hundean, he just said this as I'm recording it. He said this: I think Nigeria is officially over tonight. Bombing your neighbor because a white guy in Paris told you to, carrying out airstrikes against a fellow African country because Emmanuel Macron wanted you to. Only apartheid South Africa ever did something like this. It's over. Now, early in the morning, at 6 a.m, as the military takeover was underway, I seen Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, put out a strange tweet at 6 a.m. He said this: I spoke with President Tinubu of Nigeria. I conveyed French solidarity in the face of the various security challenges, particularly the terrorist threat in the north. At his request, we will strengthen our partnership with the authorities and our support for the affected populations. We call on all the partners to step up their engagement. Nobody can remain a spectator. So a very random cryptic tweet at 6 a.m. while the military takeover in Benin is underway. Now, keep in mind, like I told you, in Benin, the French military is already there. The French Air Force is already there. The French intelligence is already there. Like I told you, when they got kicked out of Niger, they went to Benin. So at 6 a.m, President Macron put out a random tweet on social media. I spoke with President Tinubu of Nigeria. And now, right now, the goddamn Nigerian Air Force allegedly, in collaboration with the French Air Force, is currently controlling the skies of the capital in Benin right now. So to me, like I said, I don't know. The situation is still ongoing, so we're going to see how it plays out. But it seems like this military takeover was violently put down. It seems like it was violently put down with force. And if that's the case, if that's the reality, then these guys are definitely going to jail, or they're definitely getting killed, or they're probably already dead. So we'll never know what plans they had in store, right? The same way, for example, like I said, imagine if President Chiani was removed from power. The French would still have the Iranian mines still to this day. The French would still be pillaging and pilfering still to this day, right? So we'll never know where they could have took the country, right? We'll never know if they would have kicked the French out the country. We'll never know what they could have done. We'll never know, right? We'll never know, unfortunately. But like I said, man, France, I'm telling you, France is not playing anymore because they've taken too many losses, bro. They've taken too many losses. We are literally chasing them all across the continent, right? Kick them out of Niger. You go to Burkina, we kick you out of there. You go to Niger, we kick you out of there. You go to Benin, now we about to kick you out of there. They said, no, stop it. I'm not running no more, right? That's the mentality of the Frenchmen. They not running no more, right? We even saw, I reacted to a video, a clip of the former president, Francois Hollande. He said, listen, we should have never allowed the military takeover in Mali back in 2021 to take place, because that's what led to the domino effect of us getting kicked out the whole region, getting smashed in the region. So we should have never allowed that to happen. So now these guys are more proactive. They're listen, the same day the military takeover, we launching airstrikes. Listen, it's not a game. It's not a game. That's why I really salute those guys for their courage, because that was a crazy thing to do. That was a crazy thing to do, man. You launching the takeover with the French aircrafts in the sky already? Bro, you a real one. You're a real one for that. But anyways, listen, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, I think, wow, you really disgrace yourself on a whole nother level today, brother. You really disgrace yourself on a whole nother level today. I don't know what the French have over you. I don't know what these guys have over you. Allegedly, they say back in the day, you were, involved in some illegal activity. So you might have some criminal files, under wraps. I don't really know, but it seems like, I don't know, but I really don't understand President Tinubu. I really don't understand his philosophy, his geopolitical ideology. I don't know. I don't know, but I really don't understand him. I really don't know. I really do not know. When you have a nation like Nigeria, you have to have somebody at the head of that nation that really has a plan and really has a vision for the nation and the region and the continent, because that nation is way too important to just be left in the hands of a bozo like this. I'm sorry. But anyways, this is all alleged. But anyway, this person said, according to local sources who provided me with images, Explosives have been reported at the Tignan barracks, 6 kilometers from the airport. A group of coup leaders are said to have taken refuge and barricaded themselves in these barracks, while Lieutenant Colonel Tigri, the leader of the coup, is reportedly on the run and being hunted by the authorities. Now, take a look up on the screen. This lady, I'm assuming she lives in Benin. She said this: so much misinformation is going around. Life has resumed as usual in the capital of Cotonou. I literally just ordered food at my favorite restaurant and I'm about to go for a walk at the beach. And a person responded and said, but there are confirmed reports of jets and aircrafts over the skies of the capital of Cotonou. Is it false? And then she said, yes, we heard planes roaming over a couple hours ago. So she said, listen, I'm going to the restaurant and we got the French Air Force in the sky in collaboration with their Nigerian vassals launching airstrikes on the goddamn barracks. But anyways, man, the situation is ongoing. I'll come back with some updates. Like I said, if these guys were really standing on a revolutionary business, which I believe they were because of the quick, immediate, violent reaction, then it's really a shame that one of our brothers launched airstrikes on his own brother because of that. But anyway, like I said, this is the result of the individualist black man thinking about himself and his own personal interests, right? His own personal interests. Because now I'm seeing headlines coming out saying this, right? Take a look up on the screen. Nigeria seeks French help to combat insecurity. So now we see headlines coming out as the coup d'etat is underway that Nigeria is seeking the help of the French to combat their insecurity situation, which is strange because didn't the United States already say that they were going to come in and fix the insecurity situation? They're going to come and save the Christians. Didn't the United States already say that? So for what reason would Bola Ahmed Tinubu have to go to the French for assistance? And I'll tell you why that is. It seems like the French are trying to craft the narrative. It seems like Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, woke up this morning. The French intelligence director briefed him on the ongoing situation in Benin. He reached out to President Tinubu and said, in return, right, in exchange for maybe military equipment, maybe some, brand new fighter jets, maybe some brand new equipment, for the Nigerian military or the Air Force, I need you to do me a favor, right? I need you to do me a favor and go take care of the situation that's currently underway in Benin. And in return, we're going to, bless you with all type of military equipment. We're going to open up the military arsenal, right? It's going to be amazing. It's going to be beautiful. But I need you to do me this favor, bro. I need you to do me this favor, right? They kicked me out of Mali. Fine. They threw me out of Burkina. Damn. They threw me out of Niger and that crushed the economy. I cannot lose Benin. Benin is such a strategic location and nation, and we are so heavily embedded in the economy of Benin. I cannot afford to lose Benin. You got to do me this favor, bro, and I got you. I got you. Whatever you need, I got you. I'll give you the brand new latest generation jets and drones and everything you need. Trust me, I got you, but I need you to do me this favor. And then what happened? Bola Ahmed Tinubu, because he is a self-centered black man only thinking about his own personal interests, those useless tribalist black men, right? So he said, bet, let's do it, right? Let's do it. And then what happened? The French intelligence briefed the French media. They put out a headline saying that Nigeria is seeking the assistance of the French to combat insecurity. That way, when the military exchange of equipment takes place, they can say that Nigeria, they asked for our help, and now we came to help the Nigerians and things like that, when in reality, it's most likely a favor for a favor, right? Go help me out. Go help me out and put down the rebellion in Benin. And in exchange, I'm going to bless you with the military technology, the military arsenal. We're going to open it up, right? That's what it is. But they framed the narrative as Nigeria is asking for help. Why would Nigeria ask for help when the United States is already imposing itself and saying they're already coming in regardless if Nigeria wants them to come in or not? So, and plus, the French couldn't even combat the insecurity in the Sahel. You were in Mali and Burkina and all them nations for over 10 years. You couldn't do shit. You couldn't do nothing. You made no progress. But all of a sudden, you're going to come and help Nigeria, which is an even bigger country, an even bigger nation that you have no history. You have no involvement. You're not even familiar with the terrain, but somehow you're going to help them combat insecurity when you couldn't even combat insecurity in nations where you had historical ties. Right. So please, you couldn't do nothing. Your track record of combating insecurity in Africa is terrible. You are a progenitor of terrorism. Right. You're partially the reason why the fucking region is unstable right now, because you toppled Gaddafi and destroyed the stability of the region, and all those weapons flooded the region. So how are you going to provide stability to a region that you already destabilized? You are an agent of terrorism. You are not an agent of counterterrorism and stability. your presence is synonymous with terrorism and insecurity, but somehow you're going to help the Nigerians where you couldn't help nobody in the fucking continent combat insecurity. You have no history of combating insecurity. You only have a history of creating insecurity, creating terrorism. You are an agent, a proliferator of terrorism, right? So stop it. You even have former French intelligence agents that wrote books talking about how they were directly involved in supporting terrorist groups on the continent. You have no credibility in the arena of combating insecurity. This is simply a favor for a favor. Go put down the rebellion in Benin alongside the French Air Force, and I'm going to bless you with the military equipment. But then the headline is Nigeria is seeking assistance from the French. Man, listen, I'm not falling for your propaganda, man. Man, listen, anyway, this video went way too long. The situation is still ongoing. So if there are any updates, you know I'm going to come right back. But anyway, it's your boy Never Car.
Go fix. Follow me.